Welcome, Wapham crew, guys, gals, ghouls, and otherworldly beings. Let's climb aboard the mothership, secure our tinfoil hats, buckle down tight, and hold on loosely as we soar over the rocky tops of the La Platas on a rocky mountain high, get sucked into the vortex of the Four Corners, and settle down snugly at mile marker 420 in Gulf, Colorado. I'm your ghostess, TessaTNT, broadcasting live from the Mile High Clubhouse tonight. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you, and welcome to We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. It's an honor and a pleasure and a privilege to have you hanging out with me tonight on the airwaves. If you want to listen in your free time, whether you're working it or working out, you could find us on Spreaker.com, as well as anywhere else you listen to your broadcasts and podcasts under We Are Paradox Media. And if you don't mind, mosey on over to our YouTube channel. Please subscribe, like any video that you've watched or listened to, and leave me a comment. Good, bad, yay, nay. What are your thoughts on the topic, or what are your thoughts about the show? What is something or someone you'd like me to do or have on the show? And I will try my best to do that for you. So, last night, I was really happy with that show. It went longer than I expected. It covered a lot more ground than I expected, and yeah, the subject, the amount of people actually missing or deceased is greater than originally thought. But if you didn't listen to it, listen to last night's show. That was on April 25th, 2026. Alright, so we will be reading the horror Megapack with 25 modern and classic horror stories featuring H.P. Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, Darrell Schweitzer, Henry Kuttner, William F. Nolan, Seabury Quinn, John Gregory Betancourt, and more. Lots more. And it has all the chapters down here. And we're getting pretty far into it. I think we're 500 and something pages in. We got 100 and something pages left, according to what I had seen. Oh wow. We might even have less than that. I don't know. This is on computer, rented from the library. With an arrow going backwards, it says 517. With the arrow going forward, it says 117. So we'll have to wait and see how far we actually have left to go. Alright, so we're going to be starting with the ghosts of Townley Town, I believe. Let me scroll down and see. I just looked at it. The ghost of Townley Towers. Yes, that's what it was. So that's it, eh? He exclaimed, examining one of the finished pieces of printing with interest. It was an excellent imitation of a $10 national banknote. Though showing its illegitimate origin in its fresh state, after a little handling and crumpling, it would have passed muster almost anywhere among people not trained to detect counterfeit bills. Neatly stacked on the floor were enough other spurious notes to flood an entire state, and as many more were ready for finishing touches on the press. At the farther end of the room, a heavy curtain hung before a low arched doorway. Putting it aside, the professor was not surprised to find a small underground boathouse, in which the speedboat he had seen that morning was securely moored, the entrance to the subterranean anchorage being screened by a neatly woven blind of reeds and ivy. Let me double check the volume on these. Yeah, we need to bring that down. Bring it down now. Umph, he commented. Everything seems fairly clear thus far, but I think we might do well to ask our friend Proctor a few questions before going back. Rosalie deposited her knife in the glowing charcoal brazier and blew upon the coals until the steel blade took on a brilliant orange glow. This done, she wrapped her fingers in the cotton cloth with which she had been gagged, took the red-hot knife up gingerly, and advanced until she stood directly before the bound and helpless butler. "Swine!" she admonished, speaking slowly, and in her most careful English, that every word might be understood. "Forester Sahib, who is the mightiest detector of evil in all the world, who would honor your unclean ears by addressing a few questions to them, see to it that you answer quickly and truthfully, or I shall give myself the pleasure of burning out your unworthy eyes with this iron. Say then, will it be talk or torture which you choose?" Proctor, regarding the implacable eyes she bent upon him, made a wise decision. Chapter 6. "I say, Townley, I'll trouble you for that $2,500 reward you offered for laying the ghost," Professor Forrester announced as he and Rosalie let themselves in the front door of Townley Towers and surveyed a surprised group in the lower hall. "Eh? What's that?" demanded his host, eyeing him suspiciously. "Where have you been? I thought you went upstairs, drunk a while ago. Speak up, man, if you're sober. Where in the devil of a fix? Now it's Proctor who's disappeared in." "Wrong, my boy, quite wrong you are," the professor contradicted with a grin. "Proctor may not be present, but I'll guarantee to produce him when wanted. He's the ghost of Townley Towers." "What?" "Your ghost's name is James Alberton Proctor, sometime butler to Eugene Townley, Esquire, of Baltimore and St. Mary's County, Maryland. Before he entered your employ, he was popularly known to the aristocracy of underworld as English Jimmy, and he was one of the cleverest counterfeiters, queer shooters, I believe the technical term is, in the entire nefarious business. I suppose you'll recall that, no matter how much dread of the ghost he displayed, Proctor never offered to leave your service." Yeah, that's right," Townley agreed. "Quite so, but he was forever harping on the subject to the other servants and was largely responsible for your big labor turnover. You'll also remember that he presented himself as an applicant for the position of butler after 3 Negro butlers had been scared off the premises. Very well. I've been talking with Mr. Proctor, and he's been quite confidential. Miss Osterhott," he shot a sidelong, humorous glance at a demure Rosalie, who stood at his elbow, "seemed to have quite an influence over him, and I'm sure she induced him to tell me things he never would have divulged without her persuasion. Now, to go back a little while, this Proctor person had been head of a counterfeiting gang for some time, and had been using this location as a manufacturing plant. It's conveniently inaccessible, you know, and offered an ideal location. When you decided to recondition the towers and live here, while it didn't materially interfere with his work, since it was literally carried on underground, it did render the danger of detection much greater, so he and his 2 associates, both of whom were Turkish gypsies, decided to manufacture a little ghost scare for the benefit of your servants. When he'd managed to frighten the 2 colored men off the job and scare half the other servants out of their senses, he applied for the post of butler to you. You'll recall that he was rather vague concerning how he came to hear you were in need of a butler just at that time, and came down here where he could supervise the printing operations and keep watch on you and your guests at the same time. I dare say you'll be surprised to learn that 2 of the guests at this party, Rodney Phillips and Waterford Ritchie, were members of the United States Secret Service. That was a surprise to Proctor, a most unpleasant surprise, I imagine, and threw him into something of a panic. To do him justice, Proctor was a mild-mannered sort of criminal and never resorted to violence when he could help it, but his 2 associates had no such scruples. They believed fervently in the adage that dead men tell no tales. When Thomas the stable boy surprised one of them snooping about the smokehouse last night, he was unceremoniously put to death by having his throat cut with a broken bottle. When young Phillips went out to spend the night in the smokehouse, he did it in hope of finding some lead to counterfeiter's lair, for he'd received a tip. The spurious bills were coming from this part of the state. There's a secret entrance to that smokehouse, and while Phillips was looking around, one of the gypsies let himself through it and strangled the poor lad, then hanged him to make it appear he'd committed suicide. I hate to say it, Townley, but your ancestors must have done a considerable amount of smuggling in pre-revolutionary days, for your entire grounds are honeycombed with secret passages, and there's a perfect rabbit warren of hidden stairways from the underground storehouse to your house. Practically every room in the place can be entered or left by one of those unsuspected doorways. It was easy for the gypsies to enter Ritchie's room last night, cut the poor chap's throat, then leave the razor in his hand as though he had done the deed himself. I don't claim any particular credit in the matter, but I've made a little study of crime detected as a hobby, as has Miss Osterhut, and we both became suspicious concerning the sewer slide supposed to have happened and been committed. We weren't greatly impressed with Proctor's version of Thomas's death either, and decided to do a little investigating of our own. I got the Baltimore headquarters of the Treasury Department on the wire this morning and advised them what was going on. It was then I learned that they'd narrowed their search for the counterfeiters' den down to this locality, and that you'd been under investigation, Townley. "Good God!" exclaimed his host. "Precisely," the professor responded. "I'm sorry to say that I didn't entirely divorce my mind from that suspicion for a while. You see, we didn't know whom to suspect, so we decided to regard everyone as guilty until the contrary appeared. Proctor was not caught napping, though. He must have listened in on my talk with Baltimore this evening and decided that I, too, was a Treasury man. At any rate, he and one of his companions entered Miss Osterhut's room by a secret doorway and kidnapped her, holding her as bait for a clever little trap they laid for me. I walked into it, too, just marched into it with both my eyes open, but my luck held, and the result?" He paused, surveying the circle of faces with his benign, slightly diffident smile. "Yes, the result is," chorused a dozen voices. "Treasury officers are on their way here now. I fear they'll have no use for one of the gypsies. Unfortunately, the poor fellow met with an accident while discussing the merits of the situation with me, but the other one and your butler will probably be allowed to put their names in cold storage for several years while they use numbers for identification purposes at Moundsville or Atlanta." "Well, you funny, clever little devil," Eugene Townley fairly roared, striking Professor Forrester such a blow on the back that he nearly collapsed. "You've surely earned that reward. Here, I'll make the check out right now." I believe on the whole you'd best make it payable to Miss Osterhut, the professor remarked as his host removed the cap from his fountain pen and unfolded his checkbook. It was really her persuasion which made him talk and enabled us to catch up the loose ends of the case, you see. Uncle Harvey, Rosalie protested as she paused at her bedroom door to say goodnight, you must take this check. What's mine is yours, you know, for I owe everything I have, home, food, education, even liberty and life to you. I know you don't like me to refer to myself as your slave, but if ever one person belonged to another by right of conquest and purchase, I am yours. Nonsense, the professor cut in. Keep the money, child. Some day you'll be getting married. His voice became harsh, and he looked quickly away as he spoke. Some day you'll be getting married, and the reward will come in handy to buy your trousseau. Small World by William F. Nolan. In the waiting, windless dark, Louis Stillman pressed into the building front, shadows along the Wilshire Boulevard. Breathing softly, the automatic poised and ready in his hand, he advanced with animal stealth toward Western, gliding over the night-cool concrete, past ravaged clothing shops, drug and 10-cent stores, their windows shattered, their doors ajar and swinging. The city of Los Angeles, painted in cold moonlight, was an immense graveyard. The tall white tombstone buildings thrust up from the silent pavement, shadow-carved and lonely. Overturned metal corpses of trucks, buses, and automobiles littered the streets. He paused under the wide marquee of the Fox Wiltern above his head. Rows of splintered display bulbs gaped, sharp glass teeth in wooden jaws. Louis Stillman felt as though they might drop at any moment to pierce his body. 4 more blocks to cover. His destination? A small corner delicatessen 4 blocks south of Wilshire, on Western. Tonight he intended bypassing the larger stores like Safeway or Thrift Mart with their available supplies of exotic foods. A smaller grocery was far more likely to have what he needed. He was finding it more and more difficult to locate basic foodstuffs. In the big supermarkets, only the more exotic and highly spiced canned and bottled goods remained, and he was sick of caviar and oysters. Crossing Western, he had almost reached the far curb when he saw some of them. He dropped immediately to his knees behind the rusting bulk of an Olds 88. The rear door on his side was open, and he cautiously eased himself into the back seat of the deserted car. Releasing the safety catch on the automatic, he peered through the cracked window at 6 or 7 of them as they moved toward him along the street. God, had he been seen? He couldn't be sure. Perhaps they were aware of his position? He should have remained on the open street, where he'd have running chance. Perhaps, if his aim were true, he could kill most of them, but even with its silencer, the gun would be heard, and more of them would come. He dared not fire until he was certain they discovered him. They came closer, their small dark bodies crowding the walk, 6 of them. Chattering, leaping, cruel mouths open, eyes glittering under the moon. Closer. The shrill pipings increased, rose in volume. Closer. Now he could make out their sharp teeth and matted hair. Only a few feet from the car, his hand was moist on the handle of the automatic. His heart thundered against his chest, seconds away. Now! Louis Stillman fell heavily back against the dusty seat cushion, the gun loose in his trembling hand. They had passed by. They had missed him. Their thin pipings diminished, grew faint with distance. The tomb silence of late night settled around him. The delicatessen proved a real windfall. The shelves were relatively untouched, and he had a wide choice of tinned goods. He found an empty cardboard box and hastily began to transfer the cans from the shelf nearest him. A noise from behind. A padding, scraping sound. Louis Stillman whirled around, the automatic ready. A huge mongrel dog faced him, growling deep in its throat, 4 legs braced for assault. The blunt ears were laid flat along the short-haired skull, and a thin trickle of saliva seeped from the killing jaws. The beast's powerful chest muscles were bunched for the spring when Stillman acted. The gun, he knew, was useless. The shots would be heard. Therefore, with the full strength of his left arm, he hurled a heavy can at the dog's head. The stunned animal staggered under the blow, legs buckling. Hurriedly, Stillman gathered his supplies and made his way back to the street. How much longer can my luck hold? Louis Stillman wondered as he bolted the door. He placed the box of tinned goods on a wooden table and lit the tall lamp nearby. Its flickering orange glow illuminated the narrow, low ceiling room as Stillman seated himself on one of 3 chairs facing the table. Twice tonight his mind told him, twice you've escaped them, and they could have seen you easily on both occasions, if they had been watching for you. They don't know you're alive, but when they find out... He forced his thoughts away from the scene in his mind, away from the horror. Quickly he stood up and began to unload the box, placing the cans on a long shelf along the far side of the room. He began to think of women, of a girl named Joan, and of how much he had loved her. The world of Louis Stillman was damp and lightless. It was narrow, and its cold stone walls pressed in upon him as he moved. He had been walking for several hours. Sometimes he would run, because he knew his leg muscles must be kept strong. But he was walking now, following the thin yellow beam of his hooded lantern. He was searching. Tonight, he thought, I might find another like myself. Surely someone is down here. I'll find someone if I keep searching. I must find someone. But he knew he would not. He knew he would find only chill emptiness ahead of him in the tunnels. For 3 long years he had been searching for another man or woman down here in this world under the city. For 3 years he had prowled the 700 miles of storm drains which threaded their way under the skin of Los Angeles like the veins in a man's body, and he had found nothing. Nothing. Even now, after all the days and nights of search, he could not really accept the fact that he was alone, that he was the last man alive in a city of 7 million, that all the others were dead. He paused, resting his back against the cold stone. Some of them were moving over the street above his head. He listened to the sharp, scuffling sounds on the pavement and swore bitterly. "Damn you," said Louis Stillman levelly. "Damn all of you." Louis Stillman was running down the long tunnels. Behind him, a tide of midget shadows washed from wall to wall. High keening cries, doubled and tripled by echoes, rang in his ears. Claws reached for him. He felt panting breath, like hot smoke, on the back of his neck. His lungs were bursting, his entire body aflame. He looked down at his fast-pumping legs, doing their job with piston precision. He listened to the sharp slap of his heels against the floor of the tunnel, and he thought, I might die at any moment, but my legs will escape. They will run on down the endless drains and never be caught. They move so fast while my heavy, awkward upper body rocks and sways above them slowly, slowing them down, tiring them, making them angry. How my legs must hate me. I must be clever and humor them, beg them to take me along to safety. How well they run, how sleek and fine. Then he felt himself coming apart. His legs were detaching themselves from his upper body. He cried out in horror, flailing the air with his arms, beseeching them not to leave him behind. But the legs cruelly continued to unfasten themselves. In a cold surge of terror, Louis Stillman felt himself tipping, falling toward the damp floor, while his legs raced on with a wild animal life of their own. He opened his mouth high above the insane legs and screamed, ending the nightmare. He sat up stiffly in his cot, gasping, drenched in sweat. He drew in a long, shuddering breath and reached for a cigarette. He lit it with a trembling hand. The nightmares were getting worse. He realized that his mind was rebelling as he slept, spilling forth the bottled-up fears of the day during the night hours. He thought once more about the beginning 6 years ago, about why he was still alive, the last of his kind. The alien ships had struck Earth suddenly without warning. Their attack had been thorough and deadly. In a matter of hours, the aliens had accomplished their clever mission, and the men and women of Earth were destroyed. A few survived, he was certain. He had never met any of them, but he was convinced they existed. Los Angeles was not the world, after all, and if he escaped, so must have others around the globe. He'd been working alone in the drains when the alien ships appeared, finishing a special job for the construction company on B-Tunnel. He could still hear the weird sound of the mammoth ships and feel the intense heat of their passage. Hunger had forced him out, and overnight he became a curiosity, the last man alive. For 3 years he was not harmed. He worked with them, taught them many things, and tried to win their confidence. But eventually, certain ones came to hate him, to be jealous of his relationship with the others. Luckily, he had been able to escape to the drains. That was 3 years ago, and now they had forgotten him. His later excursions to the upper level of the city had been made under cover of darkness, and he never ventured out unless his food supply dwindled. Water was provided by rain during the wet months, and by bottled liquids during the dry. He had built his one-room structure directly to the side of an overhead grating, not close enough to risk their seeing it, but close enough for light to seep in during the sunlight hours. He missed the warm feel of open sun on his body almost as much as he missed the companionship of others. But he could not think of risking himself above the drains by day. Sometimes he got insane thoughts. Sometimes, when the loneliness closed in like an immense fist, and he could no longer stand the sound of his own voice, he would think of bringing one of them down with him into the drains, one at a time. They could be handled. Then he'd remember their sharp, savage eyes, their animal ferocity, and he would realize that the idea was impossible. If one of their kind disappeared, suddenly and without trace, others would certainly become suspicious, begin to search for him, and it would all be over. Louis Stillman settled back into his pillow, pulling the blankets tight about his body. He closed his eyes and tried not to listen to the distant screams, pipings, and reedy cries filtering down from the street above his head. Finally, he slept. He spent the afternoon with Paper Woman. He lingered over the pages of some yellowed fashion magazines, looking at all the beautifully photographed models in their fine clothes. All slim and enchanting, these page women with their cool, enticing eyes and perfect smiles, all grace and softness and glitter and swirled cloth. He touched their images with gentle fingers, stroking the tawny paper hair, as though, by some magic formula, he might imbue them with life. It was easy to imagine that these women had never really lived at all, that they were simply painted in microscopic detail by sly artists to give the illusion of photos. He didn't like to think about these women and how they died. That evening, Louis Stillman watched the moon, round and high and yellow in the night sky. and he thought of his father, and of the long hikes through the moonlit Maine countryside, of hunting trips and warm campfires, of the Maine woods, rich and green in summer. He thought of his father's hopes for his future, and the words of that tall, gray-haired figure came back to him. "You'll be a fine doctor, Lewis. Study and work hard, and you'll succeed. I know you will." He remembered the long winter evenings of study at his father's great mahogany desk, poring over medical books and journals, taking notes, sifting and resifting facts. He remembered one set of books in particular, Erickson's monumental 3-volume text on surgery, richly bound and stamped in gold. He had always loved these books above all others. What had gone wrong along the way? Somehow the dream had faded. The bright goal vanished and was lost. Alright, let's see where I was. I had an incoming, so I lost my spot. Let's see. What had gone wrong along the way? Somehow the dream had faded. The bright goal vanished and was lost. After a year of pre-med at the University of Southern Cal, he had given up medicine. He had become discouraged and quite quit college to take a laborer's job with a construction company. How ironic that this move should have saved his life. He'd wanted to work with his hands, to sweat and labor with the muscles of his body. He'd wanted to earn enough to marry Joan, and then, later perhaps, he would have returned to finish his courses. It all seemed so far away now, his reason for quitting, for letting his father down. Now, at this moment, an overwhelming desire gripped him, a desire to pore over Erickson's pages once again, to recreate, even for a brief moment, the comfort and happiness of his childhood. He'd seen a duplicate set on the second floor of Pickwick's bookstore in Hollywood, in their used book department, and now he knew he must go after them, bring the books back with him to the drains. It was a dangerous and foolish desire, but he knew he would obey it. Despite the risk of death, he would go after the books tonight. Tonight. One corner of Lewis Stillman's room was reserved for weapons. His prize, a Thompson submachine, had been procured from the Los Angeles police arsenal. Supplementing the Thompson were 2 semi-automatic rifles, a Luger, a Colt .45, and a .22 caliber Hornet pistol equipped with a silencer. He always kept the smallest gun in a spring-clip holster beneath his armpit, but it was not his habit to carry any of the larger weapons with him into the city. On this night, however, things were different. The drains ended 2 miles short of Hollywood, which means he would be forced to cover a long, particularly hazardous stretch of ground in order to reach the bookstore. He therefore decided to take along the .30 caliber Savage rifle in addition to the small hand weapon. "You're a fool, Lewis," he told himself as he slid the oiled Savage from his leather case. "Are the books important enough to risk your life?" "Yes," another part of him replied. "They are that important. If you want a thing badly enough and the thing is worthwhile, then you must go after it. If fear holds you like a rat in the dark, then you are worse than a coward. You betray yourself and the civilization you represent. Go out and bring the books back." Running in the chill night wind, grass now pavement, now grass beneath his feet. Ducking into shadows, moving stealthily past shops and theaters, rushing under the cold moon, Santa Monica Boulevard, then Highland, the Hollywood Boulevard, and finally, after an eternity of heartbeats, the bookstore, Pickwick's. Lewis Stillman, his rifle over one shoulder, the small automatic gleaming in his hand, edged silently into the store. A paper battleground met his eyes. In the filtered moonlight, a white blanket of broken-backed volumes spilled across the entire lower floor. Stillman shuddered. He could envision them, shrieking, scrabbling at the shelves, throwing books wildly across the room at one another, screaming, ripping, destroying. What of the other floors? What of the medical section? He crossed to the stairs, spilled pages crackling like a fall of dry leaves under a step, and sprinted up the first short flight of the mezzanine. Similar chaos. He hurried up to the second floor, stumbling, terribly afraid of what he might find. Reaching the top, his heart thudded. He squinted into the dimness. The books were undisturbed. Apparently, they had tired of their game before reaching these. He slipped the rifle from his shoulder and placed it near the stairs. Dust lay thick all around him, powdering up and swirling as he moved down the narrow aisles. A damp, leathery mustiness lived in the air, an odor of mold and neglect. Louis Stillman paused before a dim hand-lettered sign. Medical section. It was just as he had remembered it. Holstering the small automatic, he struck a match and shading the flame with a cupped hand as he moved it along the rows of faded titles. Carter, Davidson, Enright, Erickson. He drew in his breath sharply. All 3 volumes, their gold-stamped, dust-dulled, but readable, stood in tall and perfect order on the shelf. In the darkness, Louis Stillman carefully removed each volume, blowing it free of dust. At last all 3 books were clean and solid in his hands. Well, you've done it. You've reached the books, and now they belong to you. He smiled, thinking of the moment when he would be able to sit down at the table with his treasure and linger again and again over the wondrous pages. He found an empty carton at the rear of the store and placed the books inside. Returning to the stairs, he shouldered the rifle and began his descent to the lower floor. So far, he told himself, my luck is still holding. But as Louis Stillman's foot touched the final stair, his luck ran out. The entire lower floor was alive with them, rustling like a mass of great insects, gliding toward him, eyes gleaming in the half-light. They converged up the stairs. They had been waiting for him. Now suddenly the books no longer mattered. Now only his life mattered and nothing else. He moved back against the hard wood of the stair rail, the carton of books sliding from his hands. They had stopped at the foot of the stair. They were silent, looking up at him, the hate in their eyes. If you can reach the street, Stillman told himself, then you've still got half a chance. That means you've got to get through them to the door. All right, then move. Louis Stillman squeezed the trigger of the automatic, and 3 shots echoed through the silent store. 2 of them fell under the bullets as Stillman rushed into their midst. He felt sharp nails claw at his shirt and trousers, heard the cloth ripping away in their grasp. He kept firing the small automatic into them, and 3 more dropped under the hail of bullets, shrieking in pain and surprise. The others spilled back, screaming from the door. The gun was empty. He tossed it away, swinging the heavy Savage rifle free from his shoulder as he reached the street. The night air, crisp and cool in his lungs, gave him instant hope. I can still make it, thought Stillman as he leaped the curb and plunged across the pavement. If those shots weren't heard, then I've still got the edge. My legs are strong and I can outdistance them. Luck, however, had failed him completely on this night. Near the intersection of Hollywood Boulevard and Highland, a fresh pack of them swarmed toward him over the street. He dropped to one knee and fired into their ranks, the Savage jerking in his hands. They scattered to either side. He began to run steadily down the middle of Hollywood Boulevard, using the butt of the heavy rifle like a battering ram as they came at him. As he neared Highland, 3 of them darted directly into his path. Stillman fired. One doubled over, lurched crazily into the jagged plate glass store front. Another clawed at him as he swept around the corner to Highland. he managed to shake free. The street ahead of him was clear. Now his superior leg power would count heavily in his favor. 2 miles. Could he make it back before others cut him off? Running, reloading, firing, sweat soaking his shirt, rivering down his face, stinging his eyes. A mile covered. Halfway to the drains. They had fallen back. But more of them were coming, drawing by the rifle shots pouring in from side streets, stores, and houses. His heart jarred in his body. His breath was ragged. How many of them around him? 100? 200? More coming? God! He bit down on his lower lip until the salt taste of blood was on his tongue. "You can't make it," a voice inside of him shouted. "They'll have you in another block, and you know it." He fitted the rifle to his shoulder, adjusted his aim, and fired. The long, rolling crack of the big weapon filled the night. Again and again he fired, the butt jerking into the flesh of his shoulder, the smell of powder in his nostrils. It was no use. Too many of them. Lewis Stillman knew that he was going to die. The rifle was empty at last. The final bullet had fired. He had no place to run because they were all around him, in a slowly closing circle. He looked at the ring of small, cruel faces and he thought, the aliens did their job perfectly. They stopped Earth before she could reach the age of the rocket, before she could threaten planets beyond her own moon. What an immensely clever plan it had been, to destroy every human being on Earth above the age of 6, and then to leave as quickly as they had come, allowing our civilization to continue on a primitive level, knowing that Earth's back had been broken, that her survivors would revert to savagery as they grew into adulthood. Lewis Stillman dropped the empty rifle at his feet and threw out his hands. "Listen," he pleaded. "I'm really one of you. You'll all be like me soon. Please, listen to me." But the circle tightened, relentlessly around Lewis Stillman. He was screaming when the children closed in. Creepy, I thought he was talking about aliens the whole time. Ew, kids are creepy. I got 4 of them, I should know. The Bell in the Fog by Gertrude Atherton. The Bell in the Fog by Gertrude Atherton. 1. The great author had realized one of the dreams of his ambitious youth, the possession of an ancestral hall in England. It was not so much the good American's reverence for ancestors that inspired the longing to consort with the ghosts of an ancient line, as artistic appreciation of the mellowness, the dignity, the aristocratic aloofness of walls that have sheltered, and furniture that was embraced generations and generations of the dead. To mere wealth, only his astute and incomparable modern brain yielded respect. His ego raised its gooseflesh at the sight of rooms furnished with a single check, conciliatory as the taste might be. The dumping of the old interiors of Europe into the glistening shells of the United States not only roused him almost to passionate protest, but offended his patriotism, which he classified among his unworked ideals. The average American was not an artist, therefore he had no excuse for even the affection of cosmopolitanism. Heaven knew he was national enough in everything else, from his accent to his lack of repose. Let his surroundings be in keeping. Orth had left the United States soon after his first success, and his art being too great to be confounded with locality, he had long since ceased to be spoken of as an American author. All civilized Europe furnished stages for his puppets, and, if never picturesque nor impassioned, his originality was as overwhelming as his style. His subtleties might not always be understood, indeed, as a rule they were not. but the musical mystery of his language and the penetrating charm of his lofty and cultivated mind induced raptures in the initiated, forever denied to those who failed to appreciate him. His following was not a large one, but it was very distinguished. The aristocracies of the earth gave to it, and not to understand and admire Ralph Orth was deliberately to relegate oneself to the ranks. But the elect are few, and they frequently subscribe to the circulating libraries. On the continent, they buy the Tauchnitz edition, and had not Mr. Orth inherited a sufficiency of ancestral dollars to enable him to keep rooms in Jermyn Street and the wardrobe of an Englishman of leisure, he might have been forced to consider the tastes of the middle class at a desk in Hampstead. But as it mercifully was, the fashionable and exclusive sets of London knew and sought him. He was too wary to become a fad and too sophisticated to grate or bore. Consequently, his popularity continued evenly from year to year, and long since he had come to be regarded as one of them. He was not keenly addicted to sport, but he could handle a gun, and all men respected his dignity and breeding. They cared less for his books than women did, perhaps because patience is not a characteristic of their sex. I am alluding, however, in this instance, to men of the world. A group of young literary men and one or two women put him on a pedestal and kissed the earth before it. Naturally, they imitated him, and as this flattered him, he had a kindly heart deep among the cerecloths of his formalities. He sooner or later wrote appreciations of them all, which nobody living could understand, but which, owing to the subtlety and signature, answered every purpose. With all this, however, he was not utterly content. From the 12th of August until late in the winter, when he did not go to Hamburg and the Riviera, he visited the best houses in England, slept in state chambers, and meditated in historic parks. But the country was his one passion, and he longed for his own acres. He was turning 50 when his great-aunt died and made him her heir, as a poor reward for his immortal services to literature. Read the will of this phenomenally appreciative relative. The estate was a large one. There was a rush for his books. New editions were announced. He smiled with cynicism, not unmixed with sadness, but he was very grateful for the money, and as soon as his fastidious taste would permit, he bought him a country seat. The pace gratified all his ideals and dreams, for he had romanced about this some time, English possession as he had never dreamed of women. It had once been the property of the church, and the ruin of cloister and chapel above the ancient wood was sharp against the low pale sky. Even the house itself was Tudor, but wealth from the generation to generation had kept it in repair, and the lawns were as velvety, the hedges as rigid, the trees as aged as any in his own works. It was not a castle nor a great property, but it was quite perfect. And for a long while he felt like a bridegroom on a succession of honeymoons. He often laid his hand against the rough, ivied walls in a lingering caress. After a time he returned to the hospitalities of his friends, and his invitations, given with the exclusiveness of his great distinction, were never refused. Americans visiting England eagerly sought for letters to him, and if they were sometimes benumbed by that cold and formal presence, and awed by the silence of Chillingsworth, the few who entered there, they thrilled in anticipation of verbal triumphs, and forthwith bought an entire set of his books. It was characteristic that they dared not ask him for his autograph. Although women invariably described him as brilliant, a few men affirmed that he was gentle and lovable. and any one of them was well content to spend weeks at Chillingsworth with no other companion, but on the whole he was rather a lonely man. It occurred to him how lonely he was one gay June morning when the sunlight was streaming through his narrow windows, illuminating tapestries and armor, the family portraits of the young profligate from whom he made his splendid purchase, dusting its gold on the black wood of wainscot and floor. He was in the gallery at the moment, studying one of his two favorite portraits, a gallant little lad in the green costume of Robin Hood. The boy's expression was imperious and radiant, and he had that perfect beauty which in any disposition appealed so powerfully to the author. But his Orth stared today at the brilliant youth of whose life he knew nothing. He suddenly became aware of a human stirring at the foundations of his aesthetic pleasure. "I wish he were alive and here," he thought, with a sigh. "What a jolly little companion he would be, and this fine old mansion would make a far more complimentary setting for him than for me." He turned away abruptly, only to find himself face to face with the portrait of a little girl who was quite unlike the boy, yet so perfect in her own way, and so unmistakably painted by the same hand, that he had long since concluded they had been brother and sister. "Oh no, my book just expired. I'm going to have to recheck it out. Holy shnikes." Well, that took a minute, but we got it rechecked out and we're back on a roll. She was angelically fair, and young as she was, she could not have been more than 6 years old. Her dark blue eyes had a beauty of mind which must have been remarkable 20 years later. Her pouting mouth was like a little scarlet serpent, her skin almost transparent. Her pale hair fell waving, not curled with the orthodoxy of childhood, about her tender bare shoulders. She wore a long white frock and clasped tightly against her breast a doll far more gorgeously arrayed than herself. Behind her were the ruins and the woods of Chillingsworth. Orth had studied his portrait many times for the sake of an art which he understood almost as well as his own, but today he saw only the lovely child. He forgot even the boy in the intensity of this new and personal absorption. Did she live to grow up, I wonder, he thought. She should have made a remarkable, even famous woman with those eyes and that brow. But could the spirit within that ethereal frame stand the enlightenments of maturity? Would not that mind, purged perhaps in a long probation from the draws of other existences, flee in disgust from the commonplace problems of a woman's life? Such perfect beings should die while they are still perfect. Still, it is impossible that this little girl, whoever she was idealized by the artist who painted her, his own dream of exquisite childhood. Again he turned away impatiently. "I believe I am rather fond of children," he admitted. "I catch myself watching them on the street when they are pretty enough. Well, who does not like them?" he added with some defiance. He went back to his work. He was chiseling a story which was to be the foremost excuse of a magazine as yet unborn. At the end of half an hour he threw down his wondrous instrument, which looked not unlike an ordinary pen, and making no attempt to disobey the desire that possessed him, went back to the gallery. The dark, splendid boy, the angelic little girl, were all he saw, even of the several children in that roll call of the past, and they seemed to look straight down his eyes into depths where the fragmentary ghosts of unrecorded ancestors gave faint, musical response. The dead's kindly recognition of the dead, he thought, but I wish these children were alive. For a week he haunted the gallery, and the children haunted him. Then he became impatient and angry. "I am mooning like a barren woman," he exclaimed. "I must take the briefest way of getting those youngsters off my mind." With the help of his secretary, he ransacked the library and finally brought to light the gallery catalogue which had been named in the inventory. He discovered that his children were the Viscount Tancred and the Lady Blanc Mortlake, son and daughter of the second Earl of Tynemouth. Little wiser than before, he sat down at once and wrote to the present Earl, asking for some account of the lives of the children. He awaited the answer with more restlessness than he usually permitted himself, and took long walks, ostentatiously avoiding the gallery. "I believe those youngsters have obsessed me," he thought more than once. "They certainly are beautiful enough, and the last time I looked at them in that waning light they were fairly alive. Would that they were, and scampering about this park." Lord Tynemouth, who was intensely grateful to him, answered promptly. "I am afraid," he wrote, "that I don't know much about my ancestors, those who didn't do something or other, but I have a vague remembrance of having been told, by an aunt of mine who lives on the family traditions, she isn't married, that the little chap was drowned in the river, and that the little girl died too, when she was a little girl, wasted away or something. I am such a beastly idiot about expressing myself that I wouldn't dare to write to you at all if you weren't really great. That is actually all I can tell you, and I am afraid the painter was their only biographer." The author was gratified that the girl had died young, but grieved for the boy. Although he had avoided the gallery of late, his practiced imagination had evoked from the throngs of history the high-handed and brilliant, surely adventurous career of the third Earl of Tynemouth. He had pondered upon the deep delights of himself envying the dust that was older still. He had pondered upon the deep delights of directing such a mind and character, and had caught himself envying the dust that was older still, when he read of the lad's early death in spite of his regret that such promise should have come to naught. He admitted to a secret thrill of satisfaction that the boy had so soon ceased to belong to anyone. Then he smiled with both sadness and humor. "What an old fool I am," he admitted. "I believe I not only wish those children were alive, but that they were my own." The frank admission proved fatal. He made straight for the gallery. The boy, after the interval of separation, seemed more spiritedly alive than ever. The little girl to suggest, with her faint, appealing smile, that she would like to be taken up and cuddled. "I must try another way," he thought desperately, after that long communion. "I must write them out of me." He went back to the library and locked up the tour de force, which had ceased to command his classic faculty. At once he began to write the story of the brief lives of the children, much to the amazement of that faculty which was little accustomed to the simplicities. Nevertheless, before he had written 3 chapters, he knew that he was at work upon a masterpiece, and more, he was experiencing a pleasure so keen that once and again his hand trembled, and he saw the page through a mist. Although his characters had always been objective to himself and his more patient readers, none knew better than he, a man of no delusions, that they were so remote and exclusive as barely to escape being mere mentalities. They were never the pulsing living creations of the more full-blooded genius. But he had been content to have it so. His creations might find and leave him cold, but he had known his highest satisfaction in chiseling the statutes, extracting subtle and elevating harmonies, while combining words as no man of his tongue had combined them before. But the children were not statuettes. He had loved and brooded over them long ere he had thought to tuck them into his pen, and on its first stroke they danced out alive. The old mansion echoed with their laughter, with their delightful and original pranks. Mr. Orth knew nothing of children, therefore all the pranks he invented were as original as his faculty. The little girl clung to his hand or knee as they both followed the adventurous course of their common idol, the boy. When Orth realized how alive they were, he opened each room of the home to them in turn, that evermore he might have sacred and poignant memories with all parts of the stately mansion where he must dwell alone to the end. He selected their bedrooms and hovered over them, not through infantile disorders, which were beyond even his imagination, but through those painful intervals insistent upon the enterprising spirit of the boy and the devoted obedience of the girl to fraternal command. He ignored the second Lord Tynemouth. He was himself their father, and he admired himself extravagantly for the first time. Art had chastened him long since. Oddly enough, the children had no mother, not even the memory of one. He wrote the book more slowly than was his wont, and spent delightful hours pondering upon the chapter of the morrow. He looked forward to the conclusion with a sort of terror, and made up his mind that when the inevitable last word was written, he should start at once for Hamburg. Incalculable times a day he went to the gallery, for he no longer had any desire to write the children out of his mind, and his eyes hungered for them. They were his now. It was with an effort that he sometimes humorously reminded himself that another man had fathered them, and that their little skeletons were under the choir of the chapel. Not even for peace of mind would he have descended into the vaults of the Lord of Chillingsworth and looked upon the marble effigies of his children. Nevertheless, when in a super-humorous mood, he dwelt upon his high satisfaction in having been enabled by his great-aunt to purchase all that was left of them. For 2 months he lived in his fool's paradise, and then he knew that the book must end. He nerved himself to nurse the little girl through her wasting illness, and when he clasped her hands, his own shook, his knees trembled. Desolation settled upon the house, and he wished he had left one corner of it to which he could retreat unhaunted by the child's presence. He took long tramps, avoiding the river with a sensation next to panic. It was 2 days before he got back to his table, and then he had made up his mind to let the boy live. To kill him off, too, was more than his augmented stock of a human nature could endure. After all, the lad's death had been purely accidental, wanton. It was just that he should live, with one of the author's inimitable suggestions of future greatness. But at the end, the parting was almost as bitter as the other. Orth knew then how men feel when their sons go forth to encounter the world and ask no more of the old companionship. The author's boxes were packed. He sent the manuscript to his publisher an hour after it was finished. He could not have given it a final reading to have saved it from failure, directed his secretary to examine the proof under a microscope, and left the next morning for Hamburg. There, in inmost circles, he forgot his children. He visited in several of the great houses of the continent until November, then returned to London to find his book the literary topic of the day. His secretary handed him the reviews, and for once in a way he read the finalities of the nameless. He found himself hailed as a genius and compared in astonished phrases to the prodigiously clever talent which the world for 20 years had isolated under the name of Ralph Orth. This pleased him, for every writer is human enough to wish to be hailed as a genius, and immediately. Many are, and many wait. It depends upon the fashion of the moment and the needs and bias of those who write of writers. Orth had waited 20 years, but his past was bedecked with the headstones of geniuses long since forgotten. He was gratified to come thus publicly into his estate, but soon reminded himself that all the adulation of which a belated world was capable could not give him one thrill of the pleasure which the companionship of that book had given him while creating. It was the keenest pleasure in his memory, and when a man is 50 and has written many books, that is saying a great deal. He allowed what society was in town to lavish honors upon him for something over a month, then cancelled all his engagements and went down to Chillingsworth. His estate was in Hertfordshire, that county of gentle hills and tangled lanes, of ancient oaks and wide wild heaths, of historic houses and dark woods, and green fields innumerable. A Wordsworthian shire, steeped in the deepest peace of England. As Orth drove towards his own gates, he had the typical English sunset to gaze upon, a red streak with a church spire against it. His woods were silent. In the fields the cows stood of it, as if conscious of their part. The ivy on his old grey towers had been young with his children. He spent a haunted night, but the next day stranger happenings began. Two. He rose early and went for one of his long walks. England seems to cry out to be walked upon, and Orth, like others of the transplanted, experienced to the full like country's gift of the foot restlessness and mental calm. Calm flees, however, when the ego is rampant, and today, as upon others too recent, Orth's soul was as restless as his feet. He had walked for 2 hours when he entered the wood of his neighbor's estate, a domain seldom honored by him, as it too had been bought by an American, a flighty hunting widow who displeased the fastidious taste of the author. He heard children's voices and turned with the quick prompting of retreat. As he did so, he came face to face on the narrow path with a little girl. For the moment he was possessed by the most hideous sensation which can visit a man's being, abject terror. He believed that body and soul were disintegrating. The child before him was his child, the original of a portrait in which the artist, dead 2 centuries ago, had missed exact fidelity, after all. The difference, even his rolling vision took note, lay in the warm, pure, living whiteness and the deeper spiritual suggestion of the child in his path. Fortunately for his self-respect, the surrender lasted but a moment. The little girl spoke. "You look real sick," she said. "Shall I lead you home?" The voice was soft and sweet, but the intonation, the vernacular, were American, and not of the highest class. The shock was, if possible, more agonizing than the other, but this time Orth rose to the occasion. "Who are you?" he demanded with asperity. "What is your name? Where do you live?" The child smiled an angelic smile, although she was evidently amused. "I never had so many questions asked me all at once," she said. "But I don't mind, and I'm glad you're not sick. I'm Mrs. Jenny Root's little girl. My father's dead. My name is Blanche. You are sick? No? And I live in Rome, New York State. We've come over here to visit Pa's relations." Orth took the child's hand in his. It was very warm and soft. "Take me to your mother," he said firmly. "Now at once you can return and play afterwards, and as I wouldn't have you disappointed for the world, I'll send to town today for a beautiful doll." The little girl, whose face had fallen, flashed her delight, but walked with great dignity beside him. He groaned in his depths as he saw they were pointing for the widow's house, but made up his mind that he would know the history of the child and of all her ancestors, if he had to sit down at table with his obnoxious neighbor. To his surprise, however, the child did not lead him into the park, but towards one of the old stone houses of the tenantry. "Pa's great-great-great-grandfather lived there," she remarked with an American's pride of ancestry. Orth did not smile, however. Only the warm clasp of the hand in his, the soft thrilling voice of his still mysterious companion, prevented him from feeling as if moving through the mazes of one of his own famous ghost stories. The child ushered him into the dining room, where an old man was seated at the table reading his Bible. The room was at least 800 years old. The ceiling was supported by the trunk of a tree, black and probably petrified. The windows had still their diamond panes, separated, no doubt, by the original lead. Beyond was a large kitchen in which were several women. The old man, who looked patriarchal enough to have laid the foundations of this dwelling, glanced up and regarded the visitor without hospitality. His expression softened as his eyes moved to the child. "Who have ye brought?" he asked. He removed his spectacles. "Ah!" He rose and offered the author a chair. At the same moment, the women entered the room. "Of course you've fallen in love with Blanche, sir," said one of them. "Everybody does." "Yes, that is it, quite so." Confusion still prevailing among his faculties, he clung to the naked truth. "This little girl is interested and startled me because she bears a precise resemblance to one of the portraits in Chillingsworth, painted about 200 years ago. Such extraordinary likeness do not occur without reason, as a rule, and as I admired my portrait so deeply that I have written a story about it, you will not think it unnatural if I am more than curious to discover the reason for this resemblance. The little girl tells me that her ancestors lived in this very house, and as my little girl lived next door, so to speak, there undoubtedly is a natural reason for the resemblance." His host closed the Bible, put his spectacles in his pocket, and hobbled out of the house. "He'll never talk of family secrets," said an elderly woman, who introduced herself as the old man's daughter, and had placed bread and milk before the guest. "There are secrets in every family, and we have ours, but he'll never tell those old tales, and I can tell you is that an ancestor of little Blanche went to wreck and ruin because of some fine lady's doings, and unalived himself. The story is that his boys turned out bad. One of them saw his crime and never got over the shock. He was foolish like after. The mother was a poor, scared sort of creature and hadn't much influence over the other boy. There seemed to be blight in all the man's descendants, until one of them went to America. Since then they haven't prospered exactly, but they've done better, and they don't drink so heavy." "They haven't done so well," remarked a warm, patient-looking woman. Orth typed her as belonging to the small middle class of an interior town of the eastern United States. "You are not the child's mother?" "Yes, sir. Everybody is surprised. You needn't apologize. She doesn't look like any of us, although her brothers and sisters are good enough for anybody to be proud of, but we all think she strayed in by mistake, for she looks like any lady's child, and, of course, we're only middle class." Orth gasped. It was the first time he had ever heard a Native American use the term middle class with a personal application. For the moment he forgot the child. His analytical mind raked in the new specimen. He questioned and learned that the woman's husband had kept a hat store in Rome, New York, that her boys were clerks, her girls in stores or typewriting. They kept her and little Blanche, who had come after her other children were well grown, in comfort. And they were all very happy together. The boys broke out occasionally, but on the whole were the best in the world, and her girls were worthy of far better than they had. All were robust except Blanche. "She coming so late, when I was no longer young, makes her delicate," she remarked, with a slight blush, the signal of her chaste Americanism. "But I guess she'll get along all right. She couldn't have better care if she was a queen's child." Orth, who had gratefully consumed the bread and milk, rose. "Is that really all you can tell me?" he asked. "That's all," replied the daughter of the house, "and you couldn't pry open father's mouth." Orth shook hands cordially with all of them, for he could be charming when he chose. He offered to escort the little girl back to her playmates in the wood, and she took prompt possession of his hand. As he was leaving, he turned suddenly to Mrs. Root. "Why did you call her Blanche?" he asked. "She was so white and dainty. She just looked it." Orth took the next train for London, and from Lord Tynemouth obtained the address of the aunt who lived on the family traditions, and a cordial note of introduction to her. He then spent an hour anticipating, in a toy shop, the whims and pleasures of a child, an incident of paternity which his book Children had not inspired. He bought the finest doll, piano, French dishes, cooking apparatus, and playhouse in the shop, and signed a cheque for £30, with a sensation of positive rapture. Then he took the train for Lancashire, where the Lady Mildred Mortlake lived in another ancestral home. Possibly there are a few imaginative writers who have not a leaning, secret or avowed, to the occult. The creative gift is in very close relationship with the great force behind the universe. For aught we know, may be an atom thereof. It is not strange, therefore, that the lesser and closer of the unseen forces should send their vibrations to it occasionally, or, at all events, that the imagination should incline its ear to the most mysterious and picturesque of all beliefs. Orth frankly dallied with the old dogma. He formulated no personal faith of any sort, but his creative faculty, that ego within an ego, had made more than one excursion into the invisible and brought back literary treasure. The Lady Mildred received with sweetness and warmth the generous contributor to the family sieve, and listened with fluttering interest to all he had not told the world. She had read the book, and to the strange Americanized sequel. "I am all at sea," concluded Orth. "What had my little girl to do with the tragedy? What relation was she to the lady who drove the young man to destruction?" "The closest," interrupted Lady Mildred. "She was herself." Orth stared at her. Again he had a confused sense of disintegration. Lady Mildred, gratified by the success of her bolt, proceeded less dramatically. "Wally was up here just after I read your book, and I discovered he had given you the wrong history of the picture. Not that he knew it. It is a story we have left untold as often as possible, and I tell it to you only because you would probably become monomaniac if I didn't. Blanche Mortlake, that Blanche, there had been several of her name, but there has not been one since. Did not die in childhood, but lived to be 24. She was an angelic child, but little angels sometimes grow up into very naughty girls. I believe she was delicate as a child, which probably gave her that spiritual look. Perhaps she was spoiled and flattered until her poor little soul was stifled, which is likely. At all events, she was the coquette of her day. She seemed to care for nothing but breaking hearts, and she did not stop when she married, either. She hated her husband and became reckless. She had no children. So far the tale is not an uncommon one, but the worst, and what makes the ugliest stain in our annals is to come. She was alone one summer at Chillingsworth, where she had taken temporary refuge from her husband, and she amused herself, some say, fell in love with a young man of the yeomanry, a tenant of the next estate. His name was Root. He, so it comes down to us, was a magnificent specimen of his kind, and in those days the yeomanry gave us our great soldiers. His beauty of face was quite as remarkable as his physique. He led all the rural youth in sport, and was a bit above his class in every way. He had a wife in no way remarkable, and 2 little boys, but was always more with his friends than his family. Where he and Blanche Mortlake met, I don't know. in the woods, probably, although it has been said that he had the run of the house, but at all events he was wild about her, and she pretended to be about him. Perhaps she was, for women have stooped before and since. Some women can be stormed by a fine man in any circumstances, but although I am a woman of the world, and not easy to shock, there are some things I tolerate so hardly that it is all I can do to bring myself to believe in them, and stooping is one. Well, they were the scandal of the country for months, and then, either because she had tired of her new toy, or his grammar graded after the first glamour, or because she feared her husband, who was returning from the continent, she broke off with him and returned to town. He followed her and forced his way into her house. It is said she melted, but made him swear never to attempt to see her again. He returned to his home and killed himself. A few months later, she took her own life. That is all I know. "It is quite enough for me," said Orth. The next night, as his train traveled over the great wastes of Lincolnshire, 1,000 chimneys were spouting forth columns of fire. Where the sky was not red, it was black. The place looked like hell. Another time, Orth's imagination would have gathered immediate inspiration from this wildest region of England. The fair and peaceful counties of the south had nothing to compare in infernal grandeur with these acres of flaming columns. The chimneys were invisible in the lower darkness of the night. The fires might have leaped straight from the angry cauldron of the earth. But Orth was in a subjective world, searching for all he had ever heard of occultism. He recalled that the sinful dead are doomed, according to his belief, to linger for vast reaches of time in that borderland which is close to earth, eventually sent back to work out their final salvation, that they work it out among the descendants of the people they have wronged. That suicide is held by the devotees of occultism to be a cardinal sin, abhorred and execrated. Authors are far closer to the truths enfolded in mystery than ordinary people, because of that very audacity of imagination which irritates their plotting critics, as only those who dare to make mistakes succeed greatly. Only those who shake free the wings of their imagination brush, once in a way, the secrets of the great pale world. If such writers go wrong, it is not for the mere brains to tell them so. Upon Orth's return to Chillingsworth, he called at once upon the child, and found her happy among his gifts. She put her arms about his neck and covered his serene, unlined face with soft kisses. This completed the conquest. Orth from that moment adored her as a child, irrespective of the psychological problem. Gradually he managed to monopolize her. From long walks, it was but a step to take her home for lunch. The hours of her visits lengthened. He had a room fitted up as a nursery and filled with wonders of Toyland. He took her to London to see the pantomimes, 2 days before Christmas, to buy presents for her relatives, and together they strung them upon the most wonderful Christmas tree that the old hall of Chillingsworth had ever embraced. She had a donkey cart and a trained nurse, disguised as a maid, to wait upon her. Before a month had passed, she was living in state at Chillingsworth and paying daily visits to her mother. Mrs. Root was deeply flattered and apparently well content. Orth told her plainly that he should make the child independent and educate her. Meanwhile, Mrs. Root intended to spend 6 months in England, and Orth was in no hurry to alarm her by broaching his ultimate design. He reformed Blanche's accent and vocabulary and read to her out of books which would have addled the brains of most little maids of 6. But she seemed to enjoy them, although she seldom made a comment. He was always ready to play games with her, but she was a gentle little thing, and moreover tired easily. She preferred to sit in the depths of the big chair, toasting her bare toes at the long fire in the hall. while her friend read or talked to her. Although she was thoughtful and, when left to herself, given to dreaming, his patient observation could detect nothing uncanny about her. Moreover, she had a quick sense of humor. She was easily amused and could laugh as merrily as any child in the world. He was resigned all hope of further development on the shadowy side when one day he took her to the picture gallery. It was the first warm day of summer. The gallery was not heated, and he had not dared to take his frail visitor into its chilly spaces during the winter and spring. Although he had wished to see the effect of the picture on the child, he had shrunk from the bare possibility of the very developments the mental part of him craved. The other was warmed and satisfied for the first time, and held itself aloof from disturbance. But one day the sun streamed through the old windows, and, obeying a sudden impulse, he led Blanche to the gallery. It was some time before he approached the child of his earlier love. Again he hesitated. He pointed out many other fine pictures, and Blanche smiled appreciatively at his remarks that were wise in criticism and interesting in matter. He never knew just how much she understood, but the very fact that there were depths in the child beyond his probing riveted his chains. Suddenly he wheeled about and waved his hand to her prototype. "What do you think of that?" he asked. "You remember, I told you of the likeness the day I met you." She looked indifferently at the picture, but he noticed that her color changed oddly. Its pure white tone gave place to an equally delicate gray. "I've seen it before," she said. "I came in here one day to look at it, and I've been quite often since. You never forbade me," she added, looking at him appealingly, but dropping her eyes quickly. "And I like the little girl and the boy very much." "Do you? Why?" "I don't know." A formula in which she had taken refuge before, still her candid eyes were lowered, but she was quite calm. Orth, instead of questioning, merely fixed his eyes upon her and waited. In a moment she stirred uneasily, but she did not laugh nervously, as another child would have done. He had never seen her self-possessed, ruffled, and he had begun to doubt he ever should. She was full of human warmth and affection. She seemed made for love, and every creature who came within her ken adored her, from the author himself down to the litter of puppies presented to her by the stable boy a few weeks since. But her serenity would hardly be enhanced by death. She raised her eyes finally, but not to his. She looked at the portrait. "Did you know that there was another picture behind?" she asked. "No," replied Orth, turning cold. "How did you know it?" "One day I touched a spring in the frame, and this picture came forward. Shall I show you?" "Yes." In crossing curiosity and the involuntary shrinking from impending phenomenon was a sensation of aesthetic disgust that he should be treated to a secret spring. The little girl touched hers, and that other Blanche sprang aside so quickly that she might have been impelled by a sharp blow from behind. Orth narrowed his eyes and stared at what she revealed. He felt that his own Blanche was watching him, and set his features, although his breath was short. There was the Lady Blanche Mortlake in the splendor of her young womanhood, beyond a doubt. Gone were all traces of her spirited childhood, except perhaps in the shadows of the mouth. But more than fulfilled were the promises of her mind. Assuredly, the woman had been as brilliant and gifted as she had been restless and passionate. She wore her very pearls with arrogance. Her very hands were tense with eager life. Her whole being breathed mutiny. Orth turned abruptly to Blanche, who had transferred her attention to the picture. "What a tragedy is there!" he exclaimed with a fierce attempt at lightness. "Think of a woman having all that pent up within her 2 centuries ago, and at the mercy of a stupid family, no doubt, and a still stupider husband. No wonder. Today, a woman like that might not be a model for all the virtues, but she certainly would use her gifts and become famous, the while living her life to have any place in it for yeomen and such, or even for the trivial business of breaking hearts. He put his finger under Blanche's chin and raised her face, but he could not compel her gaze. "You are the exact image of that little girl," he said, "except that you are even purer and finer. She had no chance, none whatever. You live in the woman's age. Your opportunities will be infinite. I shall see to it that they are. What you wish to be, you shall be. There will be no pent-up energies here to burst out onto disaster for yourself and others. You shall be trained to self-control, that is, if you ever develop self-will, dear child. Every faculty shall be educated. Every school of life you desire knowledge through shall be open to you. You shall become the finest flower of civilization, a woman who knows how to use her independence." She raised her eyes slowly and gave him a look which stirred the roots of sensation, a long look of unspeakable melancholy. Her chest rose once, then she set her lips tightly and dropped her eyes. "What do you mean?" he cried roughly, for his soul was chattering. Do you?" He dared not go too far and concluded lamely, "You mean you fear that your mother will not give you to me when she goes? You have divined that I wish to adopt you? Answer me, will you?" But she only lowered her head and turned away, and he feared to frighten or repel her, apologized for his abruptness, restored the outer picture to its place, and led her from the gallery. He sent her at once to the nursery, and when she came down to luncheon and took her place at his right hand, she was as natural and childlike as ever. For some days he restrained his curiosity, but one evening, as they were sitting before the fire in the hall listening to the storm, and just after he had told her the story of the Earl King, he took her on his knee and asked her gently if she would not tell him what had been in her thoughts when he had drawn her brilliant future. Again her face turned gray, and she dropped her eyes. "I cannot," she said. Perhaps. I don't know." "Was it what I suggested?" She shook her head, then looked at him with a shrinking appeal which forced him to drop the subject. He went the next day alone to the gallery and looked long at the portrait of the woman. She stirred no response in him, nor could he feat that the woman of Blanche's future would stir the man in him. The paternal was all he had to give, but that was hers forever. He went out into the park and found Blanche digging in her garden, very dirty and absorbed. The next afternoon, however, entering the hall noiselessly, he saw her sitting in her big chair, gazing out into nothing visible, her whole face settled in melancholy. He asked her if she were ill, and she recalled herself at once, but confessed to be feeling tired. Soon after this, he noticed that she lingered longer in the comfortable depths of her chair, and seldom went out except with herself. She insisted that she was quite well, but after he had surprised her again, looking as sad as if she had renounced every joy of childhood, he summoned from London a doctor renowned for his success with children. The scientist questioned and examined her. When she had left the room, he shrugged his shoulders. She might have been born with 10 years of life in her, or she might grow up into a buxom woman, he said. I confess I cannot tell. She appears to be sound enough, but I have no X-rays in my eyes, and for all I know, she may be on the verge of decay. She certainly has the look of those who die young. I have never seen so spiritual a child, but I can put my finger on nothing. Keep her out of doors. Don't give her sweets, and don't let her catch anything if you can help it. Orth and the child spent the long warm days of summer under the trees of the park, or driving in the quiet lanes. Guests were unbidden, and his pen was idle. All that was human in him had gone out to Blanche. He loved her, and she was a perpetual delight to him. The rest of the world received the large measure of his indifference. There was no further change in her, and apprehension slept and let him sleep. He had persuaded Mrs. Root to remain in England for a year. He sent her theatre tickets every week and placed a horse and phaeton at her disposal. She was enjoying herself and seeing less and less of Blanche. He took the child to Bournemouth for a fortnight, and again to Scotland, both of which outings benefited as much as they pleased her. She had begun to tyrannize over him amiably, and she carried herself quite royally. But she was always sweet and truthful, and these qualities combined with that something in the depths of her mind which defied his explorations held him captive. She was devoted to him and cared for no other companion, although she was demonstrative to her mother when they met. It was in the 10th month of this idyll of the lonely man and the lonely child that Mrs. Root flurried entered the library of Chillingsworth, where Orth happened to be alone. "Oh, sir," she exclaimed, "I must go home. My daughter Grace writes me. She should have done it before. That the boys are not behaving as well as they should. She didn't tell me. As I was having such a good time, she just hated to worry me. Heaven knows I've had enough worry, but now I must go. I just couldn't stay. Boys are an awful responsibility. Girls ain't a circumstance to them, although mine are a handful sometimes." Orth had written about too many women to interrupt the flow. He let her talk until she paused to recuperate her forces. Then he said quietly, "I am sorry this has come so suddenly, for it forces me to broach a subject at once which I would rather have postponed until the idea had taken possession of you by degrees. I know that it is you want to say, sir," she broke in, "and I've reproached myself that I haven't warned you before, but I didn't like to be the one to speak first. You want Blanche, of course. I couldn't help seeing that, but I can't let her go, sir. Indeed, I can't." "Yes," he said firmly, "I want to adopt Blanche, and I hardly think you can refuse, for you must know how greatly it will be to her advantage. She is a wonderful child. You have never been blind to that. She should have every opportunity, not only of money, but of association. If I adopt her legally, I shall, of course, make her my heir, and there's no reason why she should not grow up as great a lady as any in England." The poor woman turned white and burst into tears. "I've sat up nights and nights struggling," she said, when she could speak. "That and missing her. I couldn't stand in her light, and I let her stay. I know I oughtn't to. Now, I mean, stand in her light, but, sir, she is dearer than all the others put together." "Then live here in England, at least, for some years longer. I will gladly relieve your children of your support, and you can see Blanche as often as you choose." "I can't do that, sir. After all, she is only one, and here are 6 others. I can't desert them. They all need me, if only to keep them together. 3 girls unmarried and out in the world, and 3 boys just a little inclined to be wild. There's another point, sir. I don't exactly know how to say it." "Well?" asked Orth kindly. This American woman thought him the ideal gentleman, although the mistress of the estate on which she visited called him a bore and a snob. "It is, well, you must know, you can imagine, that her brothers and sisters just worship Blanche. They save their dimes to buy her everything she wants, or used to want. Heaven knows what will satisfy her now, although I can't see that she's one bit spoiled. But she's just like a religion to them. They're not much on church, I'll tell you, sir, what I couldn't say to anyone else, not ever to these relations who've been so kind to me, but there's wildness, just a streak in all my children, and I believe, I know, it's Blanche that keeps them straight. My girls get bitter sometimes, work all week, and little fun, not caring for common men, and no chance to marry gentlemen, and sometimes they break out and talk dreadful. Then when they're over it, they say they'll live for Blanche. They've said it over and over, and they mean it. Every sacrifice they've made for her, and they've made many, has done them good. It isn't that Blanche ever says a word of the preachy sort, or has anything of the Sunday school child about her, or even tries to smooth them down when they're excited. It's just herself. The only thing she ever does is sometimes to draw herself up and look scornful, and that nearly kills them. Little as she is, they're crazy about having her respect. I've grown superstitious about her. Until she came, I used to get frightened terribly sometimes, and I believe she came for that. So, you see, I know Blanche is too fine for us and ought to have the best, but then they are to be considered too. They have their rights, and they've got much more good than bad in them. I don't know. It's kept me awake many nights. Worth rose abruptly. Perhaps you will take some further time to think it over, he said. You can stay a few weeks longer, and the matter cannot be so pressing as that. The woman rose. I've thought this, she said. Let Blanche decide. I believe she knows more than any of us. I believe that whichever way she decided would be right. I won't say anything to her, so you won't think I'm working on her feelings, and I can trust you, but she'll know. Why do you think that? Asked Orth sharply. There is nothing uncanny about the child. She is not yet 7 years old. Why should you place such a responsibility upon her? Do you think she's like other children? I know nothing of other children. I do, sir. I've raised 6, and I've seen hundreds of others. I never was one to be a fool about my own, but Blanche isn't like any other child living. I'm certain of it. What do you think? And the woman answered according to her lights. I think she's an angel, and came to us because we needed her. And I think she is Blanche Mortlake, working out the last of her salvation, thought the author, but he made no reply and was alone in a moment. It was several days before he spoke to Blanche, and then one morning when she was sitting on her mat on the lawn with the light full upon her, he told her abruptly that her mother must return home. To his surprise, but an unutterable delight, she burst into tears and flung herself into his arms. You need not leave me, he said when he could find his own voice. You can stay here always and be my little girl. It all rests with you. I can't stay, she sobbed. I can't. And that is what made you so sad once or twice? He asked with a double eagerness. She made no reply. Oh, he said passionately. Give me your confidence, Blanche. You are the only breathing thing that I love. If I could, I would, she said. But I don't know. Not quite. How much do you know? But she sobbed again and would not answer. He dared not risk too much. After all, the physical barrier between the past and the present was very young. Well, then, we will talk about the other matter. I will not pretend to disguise the fact that your mother is distressed at the idea of parting from you, and thinks it would be as sad for your brothers and sisters, whom she says you influence for their good. Do you think that you do? Yes. How do you know this? Do you know why you know everything? No, my dear, and I have great respect for your instincts, but your sisters and brothers are now old enough to take care of themselves. They must be of poor stuff if they cannot live properly without the aid of a child. Moreover, they will be marrying soon. That will also mean that your mother will have many little grandchildren to console her for your loss. I will be the one bereft if you leave me. I am the only one who really needs you. I don't say I will go to the bad, as you may have very foolishly persuaded yourself your family will do without you, but I trust to your instincts to make you realize how unhappy, how inconsolable I shall be. I shall be the loneliest man on earth. She rubbed her face deeper into his flannels and tightened her embrace. "Can't you come too?" she asked. "No, you must live with me wholly or not at all. Your people are not my people. Their ways are not my ways. We should not get along, and if you lived with me over there, you might as well stay here, for your influence over them would be quite as removed. Moreover, if they are of the right stuff, the memory of you will be quite as potent for good as your actual presence." "Not unless I died." Again, something within him trembled. "Do you believe you are going to die young?" he blurted out. But she would not answer. He entered the nursery abruptly the next day and found her packing her dolls. When she saw him, she sat down and began to weep hopelessly. He knew then that his fate was sealed, and when, a year later, he received her last little scrawl, he was almost glad that she went when she did. The Corpse on the Grating by Hugh B. Cave. It was 10 o'clock in the morning of December 5th when M.S. and I left the study of Professor Darrell. You are perhaps acquainted with M.S. His name appears constantly in the pages of the Illustrated News, in conjunction with some very technical article on psychoanalysis or with some extensive study of the human brain and its functions. He is a psychofanatic, more or less, and has spent an entire lifetime of some 70-odd years in pulling apart human skulls for the purpose of investigation. Lovely pursuit. For some 20 years I have mocked him in a friendly, half-hearted fashion. I am a medical man, and my own profession is one that does not sympathize with radicals. As for Professor Darrell, the third member of our triangle, perhaps, if I take a moment to outline the events of that evening, the professor's part in what follows will be less obscure. We had called on him, M.S. and I, at his urgent request. His rooms were in a narrow, unlighted street just off the square, and Darrell himself opened the door to us. A tall, loosely built chap he was, standing in the doorway like a motionless ape, arms half extended. "I've summoned you, gentlemen," he said quietly, "because you two, of all London, are the only persons who know the nature of my recent experiments. I should like to acquaint you with the results." He led the way to his study, then kicked the door shut with his foot, seizing my arm as he did so. Quietly he dragged me to the table that stood against the farther wall. In the same even, unemotional tone of a man completely sure of himself, he commanded me to inspect it. For a moment in the semi-gloom of the room I saw nothing. At length, however, the contents of the table revealed themselves, and I distinguished a motley collection of test tubes, each filled with some fluid. The tubes were attached to each other by some ingenious arrangement of thistles, and at the end of the table, where a chance blow could not brush it aside, lay a tiny phial of the resulting serum. From the appearance of the table, Darrell had evidently drawn a certain amount of gas from each of the smaller tubes, distilling them through acid into the minute phial at the end. Yet, even now, as I stared down at the fantastic paraphernalia before me, I could sense no conclusive reason for its existence. I turned to the professor with a quiet stare of bewilderment. He smiled. "The experiment is over," he said. "As to its conclusion, you, Darrell, as a medical man, will be skeptical, and you," turning to M.S., "as a scientist, you will be amazed. I, being neither physician nor scientist, am merely filled with wonder." He stepped to a long square table-like structure in the center of the room. Standing over it, he glanced quizzically at M.S., then at me. "For a period of 2 weeks," he went on, "I have kept on the table here the body of a man who has been dead more than a month. I have tried, gentlemen, with acid combinations of my own origination to bring that body back to life, and I have failed. But, he added quickly, noting the smile that crept across my face, that failure was in itself worth more than the average scientist's greatest achievement, you know, Dale. That heat, if a man is not truly dead, will sometimes resurrect him. In a case of epilepsy, for instance, victims have been pronounced dead only to return to life, sometimes in the grave. I say, if a man be not truly dead, but what if that man is truly dead? Does the cure alter itself in any manner? The motor of your car dies. Do you bury it? You do not. You locate the faulty part, correct it, and infuse new life. And so, gentlemen, after remedying the ruptured heart of this dead man, by operation I proceeded to bring him back to life. I used heat. Terrific heat will sometimes originate a spark of new life in something long dead. Gentlemen, on the 4th day of my tests, following a continued application of electric and acid heat, the patient... Jamlier leaned over the table and took up a cigarette. Lighting it, he dropped the match and resumed his monologue. The patient turned suddenly over and drew his arm weakly across his eyes. I rushed to his side. When I reached him, the body was once again stiff and lifeless, and it has remained so. The professor stared at us quietly, waiting for comment. I answered him, as carelessly as I could, with a shrug of my shoulders. Professor, have you ever played with the dead body of a frog? I said softly. He shook his head silently. You would find it interesting sport, I told him. Take a common dry cell battery with enough voltage to render a sharp shock. Then apply your wires to various parts of the frog's anatomy. If you are lucky and strike the right set of muscles, you will have the pleasure of seeing a dead frog leap suddenly forward. Understand, he will not regain life. You have merely released his dead muscles by shock and sent him bolting. The professor did not reply. I could feel his eyes on me, and I turned, I should probably had found MS glaring at me in honest hate. These men were students of mesmerism, of spiritualism, and my commonplace contradiction was not over welcome. You are cynical, Dill, said MS coldly, because you do not understand. Understand? I'm a doctor, not a ghost. But MS had turned eagerly to the professor. Where is this body, this experiment? He demanded. Daumier shook his head. Evidently he had acknowledged failure and did not intend to drag his dead man before our eyes, unless he could bring that man forth alive, upright and ready to join our conversation. I've put it away, he said distantly. There's nothing more to be done, now that our reverend doctor has insisted in making a matter-of-fact thing out of our experiment. You understand, I had not intended to go in for wholesale resurrection, even if I had met with success. It was my belief that a dead body, like a dead piece of mechanism, can be brought to life again, provided we are intelligent enough to discover the secret. And by God, it is still my belief. That was the situation then, when MS and I paced slowly back along the narrow street that contained the professor's dwelling place. My companion was strangely silent. More than once I felt his eyes upon me in an uncomfortable stare, yet he said nothing. Nothing, that is, until I had opened the conversation with some casual remark about the lunacy of the man we had just left. You are wrong in mocking him, Dale, MS replied bitterly. Daumier is a man of science. He's no child experimenting with a toy. He's a grown man who has the courage to believe in his powers. One of these days... He had intended to say that someday I should respect the professor's efforts. One of these days... The interval of time was far shorter than anything so indefinite. The first event, with its succeeding series of horrors, came within the next 3 months. We had reached a more deserted section of the square, a black, uninhabited street extending like a shadowed band of darkness between gaunt high walls. I had noticed for some time that the stone structure beside us seemed to be unbroken by the door or window, that it appeared to be a single gigantic building, black and forbidding. I mentioned the fact to MS. "The warehouse," he said simply. "A lonely, God-forsaken place. We shall probably see the flicker of the watchman's light in one of the upper clinks." At his words, I glanced up. True enough, the higher part of the grim structure was punctured by narrow barred openings. Safety bolts, probably, but the light, unless its tiny gleam was somewhere in the inner recesses of the warehouse, was dead. The building was like an immense burial vault, a tomb, silent and lifeless. We had reached the most forbidding section of the narrow street, where a single arched lamp overhead cast a halo of ghastly yellow light over the pavement. At the very rim of the circle of illumination, where the shadows were deeper and more silent, I could make out the black moldings of a heavy iron grating. The bars of metal were designed, I believe, to seal the side entrance of the great warehouse from night marauders. It was bolted in place and secured with a set of immense chains, immovable. This much I saw as my intent gaze swept the wall before me. This huge tomb of silence held for me a peculiar fascination, and as I paced along beside my gloomy companion, I stared directly ahead of me into the darkness of the street. I wished to God my eyes had been closed or blinded. He was hanging on the grating, hanging there with white, twisted hands, clutching the rigged bars of iron, straining to force them apart. His whole distorted body was forced against the barrier, like the form of a madman struggling to escape from his cage. His face, the image of it, still haunts me whenever I see iron bars in the darkness of passage. Was the face of a man who has died from utter, stark horror. It was frozen in a silent shriek of agony, staring out at me with a fiendish maliciousness. Lips twisted apart, white teeth gleaming in the light, bloody eyes with a horrible glare of colorless pigment, and dead. I believe MS saw him at the very instant I recoiled. I felt a sudden grip on my arm, and then, as an exclamation came harshly from my companion's lips, I was pulled forward roughly. I found myself staring straight into the dead eyes of the fearful thing before me, found myself standing rigid, motionless, before the corpse that hung within reach of my arm. And then, through that overwhelming sense of the horrible, came the quiet voice of my comrade, the voice of a man who looks upon death as nothing more than an opportunity for research. "The fellow has been frightened to death, Darrell. Frightened most horribly. Note the expression of his mouth, the evident struggle to force these bars apart and escape. Something has driven fear to his soul and killed him." I remember the words vaguely. When MS had finished speaking, I did not reply. Not until he had stepped forward and bent over the distorted face of the thing before me did I attempt to speak. When I did, my thoughts were a jargon. "What in God's name," I cried, "could have brought such horror to a strong man? What?" "Loneliness, perhaps," suggested MS with a smile. "The fellow is evidently the watchman. He is alone in a huge, deserted pit of darkness for hours at a time. His light is merely a ghostly ray of illumination, hardly enough to do more than increase the darkness. I have heard of such cases before." He shrugged his shoulders. Even as he spoke, I sensed the evasion in his words. When I replied, he hardly heard my answer, for he had suddenly stepped forward where I could look directly into these fear-twisted eyes. "Dale," he said at length, turning slowly to face me, "you ask for an explanation of this horror? There is an explanation. It is written with an almost fearful clearness on this fellow's mind. Yet if I tell you, you will return to your old skepticism, your damnable habit of disbelief." I looked at him quietly. I heard MS claim, at other times, that he could read the thoughts of a dead man by the mental image that lay on the man's brain. I had laughed at him. Evidently, in the present moment, he recalled those laughs. Nevertheless, he faced me seriously. "I can see two things, Dale," he said deliberately. "One of them is a dark, narrow room, a room piled with indistinct boxes and crates, and with an open door bearing the black number 4617. And in that open doorway, coming forward with slow steps, alive, with arms extended, and a frightful face of passion, is a decayed human form. A corpse, Dale. A man who has been dead for many days and is now alive." MS turned slowly and pointed with upraised hand to the corpse on the grating. "That is why," he said simply, "this fellow died from horror." His words died into emptiness. For a moment I stared at him. Then, in spite of our surroundings, in spite of the late hour, the loneliness of the street, the awful thing beside us, I laughed. He turned upon me with a snarl. For the first time in my life I saw MS convulsed with rage. His old lined face had suddenly become savage with intensity. "You laugh at me, Dale?" he thundered. "By God, you make a mockery out of a science that I have spent more than my life in studying. You call yourself a medical man, and you are not fit to carry the name. I will wager you, man, that your laughter is not backed by courage." I fell away from him. Had I stood within reach, I am sure he would have struck me. Struck me! And I have been nearer to MS for the past 10 years than any man in London, and as I retreated from his temper, he reached forward to seize my arm. I could not help but feel impressed at his grim intentness. "Look here, Dale," he said bitterly. "I will wager you £100 that you will not spend the remainder of this night in the warehouse above you. I will wager £100 against your own courage that you will not back your laughter by going through what this fellow has gone through, that you will not prowl through the corridors of this great structure until you have found room 4167 and remain in that room until dawn." There was no choice. I glanced at the dead man, at the face of fear, and the clutching, twisted hands, and a cold dread filled me. But to refuse my friend's wager would have been to brand myself an empty coward. I had mocked him. Now, whatever the cost, I must stand ready to pay for that mockery. "Room 4167, I replied quietly in a voice which I made every effort to control, lest he should discover the tremor in it. "Very well, I will do it." It was nearly midnight when I found myself alone, climbing a musty winding ramp between the first and second floors of the deserted building. Not a sound except the sharp intake of my breath and the dismal creak of the wooden stairs echoed through that tomb of death. There was no light, not even the usual dim glow that is left to illuminate an unused corridor. Moreover, I had brought no means of light with me. Nothing but a half-empty box of safety matches which, by some unholy premonition, I had forced myself to save for some future moment. The stairs were black and difficult, and I mounted them slowly, groping with both hands along the rough wall. I had left MS some few moments before. In his usual decisive manner, he had helped me to climb the iron grating and lower myself to the sealed alleyway on the farther side. Then, leaving him without a word, for I was bitter against the triumphant tone of his parting words, I proceeded into the darkness, fumbling forward until I had discovered the open door in the lower part of the warehouse. And then the ramp, winding crazily upward, seemingly without end. I was seeking blindly for that particular room, which was to be my destination, room 4167, with its high number, could hardly be on the lower floors, and so I had stumbled upward. It was at the entrance of the second-floor corridor that I struck the first of my desultory supply of matches, and by its light discovered a placard nailed to the wall. The thing was yellow with age and hardly legible. In the drab light of the match, I had difficulty in reading it, but as far as I can remember, the notice went something like this: Warehouse rules. No light shall be permitted in any room or corridor as a prevention against fire. No person shall be admitted to rooms or corridors unless accompanied by an employee. A watchman shall be on the premises from 7 p.m. until 6 a.m. He shall make the round of the corridors every hour during that interval at 1/4 the hour. Rooms are located by their numbers, the first figure in the room number indicating its floor location. I could read no further. The match in my fingers burned to a black shred and dropped. Then, with the burnt stump still in my hand, I groped through the darkness to the bottom of the second ramp. Room 4167, then, was on the 4th floor, the topmost floor of the structure. I must confess that the knowledge did not bring any renewed burst of courage. The top floor, 3 black stair pits would lie between me and the safety of escape. There would be no escape. No human being in the throes of fear could hope to discover that tortured outlet, could hope to grope his way through Stygian gloom down a triple ramp of black stairs. And even though he succeeded in reaching the lower corridors, there was still a blind alleyway sealed at the outer end by a high grating of iron bars. Escape! The mockery of it caused me to stop suddenly in my ascent and stand rigid, my whole body trembling violently. But outside in the gloom of the street, MS was waiting with that fiendish glare of triumph that would brand me a man without courage. I could not return to face him, not though all the horrors of hell inhabited this gruesome place of mystery. And horrors must surely inhabit it, else how could one account for that fearful thing on the grating below? But I had been through horror before. I had seen a man supposedly dead on the operating table jerk suddenly to his feet and scream. I had seen a young girl, not long before, awake in the midst of an operation with a knife already in her frail body. Surely after those definite horrors, no unknown danger would send me cringing back to the man who was waiting so bitterly for me to return. Those were the thoughts pregnant in my mind as I groped slowly, cautiously, along the corridor of the upper floor, searching each closed door for the indistinct number 4167. The place was like the center of a huge labyrinth, a spiderweb of black, repelling passages, leading into some central chamber of utter silence and blackness. I went forward with dragging steps, fighting back the dread that gripped me as I went farther and farther from the outlet of escape. And then, after losing myself completely in the gloom, I threw aside all thoughts of return and pushed on with a careless surface bravado and laughed aloud. So at length, I reached that room of horror, secreted high in the deeper recesses of the deserted warehouse. The number, God grant I never see it again, was scrawled in black chalk on the door, 4167. I pushed the half-open barrier wide and entered. It was a small room, even as MS had forewarned me, or as the dead mind of that thing on the grate had forewarned MS. The glow of my outthrust match revealed a great stack of dusty boxes and crates piled against the farther wall, revealed, too, the black corridor beyond the entrance, and a small upright table before me. It was the table, and the stool beside it that drew my attention and brought a muffled exclamation from my lips. The thing had been thrust out of its usual place, pushed aside as if some frenzied shape had lunged against it. I could make out its former position by the marks on the dusty floor at my feet. Now it was near to the center of the room, and had been wrenched sideways from its holdings. A shudder took hold of me as I looked at it. A living person sitting on the stool before me, staring at the door, would have wrenched the table in just this manner in his frenzy to escape from the room. The light of the match died, plunging me into a pit of gloom. I struck another and stepped closer to the table, and there, on the floor, I found two more things that brought fear to my soul. One of them was a heavy flash lamp, a watchman's lamp, where it had evidently been dropped. Been dropped in flight? But what awful terror must have gripped the fellow to make him forsake his only means of escape through those black passages? And the second thing, a worn copy of a leather-bound book, flung open on the boards below the stool. The flash lamp, thank God, had not been shattered. I switched it on, directing its white circle of light over the room. This time, in the vivid glare, the room became even more unreal. Black walls, clumsy, distorted shadows on the wall, thrown by those huge piles of wooden boxes. Shadows that were like crouching men, groping toward me, and beyond, where the single door opened into the passage of Stygian darkness, that yawning entrance was thrown into hideous detail. Had any upright figure been standing there, the light would have made an unholy, phosphorescent specter out of it. I summoned enough courage to cross the room and pull the door shut. There was no way of locking it. Had I been able to fasten it, I should surely have done so, but the room was evidently an unused chamber, filled with empty refuse. This was the reason, probably, why the watchman had made use of it as a retreat during the intervals between his rounds. But I had no desire to ponder over the sordidness of my surroundings. I returned to my stool in silence and stooped, picked up the fallen book from the floor. Carefully I placed the lamp on the table, where its light would shine on the open page. Then, turning the cover, I began to glance through the thing which the man before me had evidently been studying. And before I had read 2 lines, the explanation of the whole horrible thing struck me. I stared dumbly down at the little book and laughed harshly, so that the sound of my mad cackle echoed in 1,000 ghastly reverberations through the dead corridors of the building. It was a book of horror, of fantasy, a collection of weird, terrifying, supernatural tales with grotesque illustrations in funeral black and white. And the very line I had turned to, the line which had probably struck terror to that unlucky devil's soul, explained M.S.'s decayed human form, standing in the doorway with arms extended and a frightful face of passion. The same description lay before me, almost in my friend's words. Little wonder that the fellow on the grating below, after reading this orgy of horror, had suddenly gone mad with fright. Little wonder that the picture engraved on his dead mind was a picture of a corpse standing in the doorway of room 4167. I glanced at that doorway and laughed. No doubt of it, it was the awful description in M.S.'s untempered language that had made me dread my surroundings, not the loneliness and silence of the corridors about me. Now, as I stared at the room, the closed door, the shadows on the wall, I could not repress a grin. But the grin was not long in duration. A 6-hour siege awaited me before I could hear the sound of human voice again. 6 hours of silence and gloom. I did not relish it. Thank God the fellow before me had had foresight enough to leave his book of fantasy for my amusement. I turned to the beginning of the story. A lovely beginning it was, outlining in some detail how a certain Jack Fulton, English adventurer, had suddenly found himself imprisoned by a mysterious black gang of monks, or something of the sort, in a forgotten cell at the monastery of El Toro. The cell, according to the pages before me, was located in the empty, haunted pits below the stone floors of the structure. Lovely setting. And the brave Fulton had been secured firmly to a huge metal ring set in the further wall opposite the entrance. I read the description twice. At the end of it, I could not help but lift my head to stare at my own surroundings. Except for the location of the cell, I might have been in the same setting. The same darkness, same silence, same loneliness, peculiar similarity, and then Fulton lay quietly without attempt to struggle in the dark. The stillness of the vaults became unbearable, terrifying. Not a suggestion of sound except the scraping of unseen rats. I dropped the book with a start. From opposite end of the room in which I sat came a half-inaudible scuffle noise, the sound of hidden rodents scrambling through the great pile of boxes. Imagination? I am not sure. At the moment I would have sworn that the sound was a definite one, that I had heard it distinctly. Now as I recount this tale of horror, I am not sure. But I am sure of this. There was no smile on my lips as I picked up the book again with trembling fingers and continued. The sound died into silence. For an eternity, the prisoner lay rigid, staring at the open door of his cell. The opening was black, deserted like the mouth of a deep tunnel leading to hell. And then, suddenly, from the gloom beyond that opening, came an almost noiseless, padded footfall. This time there was no doubt of it. The book fell from my fingers, dropped to the floor with a clatter. Yet even through the sound of its falling, I heard that fearful sound, the shuffle of a living foot. I sat motionless, staring with bloodless face at the door of the room 4167, and as I stared, the sound came again and again, the slow tread of dragging footsteps, approaching along the back corridor without. I got to my feet like an automation, swaying heavily. Every drop of courage ebbed from my soul as I stood there, one hand clutching the table waiting. And then, with an effort, I moved forward. My hand was outstretched to grasp the wooden handle of the door, and I did not have the courage. Like a cowed beast, I crept back to my place and slumped down on the stool, my eyes still transfixed in a mute stare of terror. I waited. For more than half an hour, I waited, motionless. Not a sound stirred in the passage beyond that closed barrier. Not a suggestion of any living presence came to me. Then, leaning back against the wall with a harsh laugh, I wiped away the cold moisture that had trickled over my forehead into my eyes. It was another 5 minutes before I picked up the book again. You call me a fool for continuing it? A fool? I tell you, even a story of horror is more comfort than a room of grotesque shadows and silence. Even a printed page is better than grim reality. And so I read on. The story was one of suspense, madness. For the next few pages I read a cunning description of the prisoner's mental reaction. Strangely enough, it conformed precisely with my own. Fulton's head had fallen to his chest, the script read. For an endless while he did not stir, did not dare to lift his eyes, and then, after more than an hour of silent agony and suspense, the boy's head came up mechanically. Came up and suddenly jerked rigid. A horrible scream burst from his dry lips as he stared like a dead man, at the black entrance to his cell. There, standing without motion in the opening, stood a shrouded figure of death, empty eyes glaring with awful hate, bored into his own, great arms, bony and rotten, extended toward him, decayed flesh. I read no more. Even as I lunged to my feet, with that mad book still gripped in my hand, I heard the door of my room grind open. I screamed in utter horror at the thing I saw there. Dead? Good God, I do not know. It was a corpse, a dead human body standing before me, like some propped-up thing from the grave. A face half eaten away, terrible in its leering grin, twisted mouth with only a suggestion of lips, curled back over broken teeth, hair writhing, distorted, like a mass of moving, bloody coils, and its arms, ghastly, white, bloodless, were extended towards me with open, clutching hands. It was alive! Alive! Even while I stood there, crouching against the wall, it stepped forward toward me. I saw a heavy shudder pass over it, and the sound of its scraping feet burned its way into my soul. And then, with its second step, the fearful thing stumbled to its knees. The white gleaming arms, thrown into streaks of living fire by the light of my lamp, flung violently upwards, twisting toward the ceiling. I saw the grin change to an expression of agony, of torment, and then the thing crashed upon me, dead. With a great cry of fear, I stumbled to the door. I groped out of that room of horror, stumbled along the corridor, no light. I left it behind on the table, to throw a circle of white glare over the decayed, living dead intruder who had driven me mad. My return down those winding ramps to the lower floor was a nightmare of fear. I remember that I stumbled, that I plunged through the darkness like a man gone mad. I had no thought of caution, no thought of anything except escape. And then the lower door, and the alley of gloom. I reached the grating, flung myself upon it, and pressed my face against the bars in a futile effort to escape. The same as the fear-tortured man who had come before me. I felt strong hands lifting me up, a dash of cool air, and then the refreshing patter of fallen rain. It was the afternoon of the following day, December 6th, when MS sat across the table from me in my own study. I had made a rather hesitant attempt to tell him, without dramatics, and without dwelling on my own lack of courage, of the events of the previous night. "You deserved it, Dell," he said quietly. "You are a medical man, nothing more, and yet you mock the beliefs of a scientist as great as Damier. I wonder, do you still mock the professor's beliefs? That he can bring a dead man to life?" I smiled a bit doubtfully. "I will tell you something, Dell," said MS deliberately. He was leaning across the table, staring at me. The professor made only one mistake in this great experiment. He did not wait long enough for the effect of his strange acids to work. He acknowledged failure too soon and got rid of the body. He paused. "When the professor stored his patient away, Dell," he said quietly, "he stored it in room 4170 at the great warehouse. If you are acquainted with that place, you will know that room 4170 is directly across the corridor from 4167. The Man Who Collected Knives by John Gregory Betancourt. "Jason, are you listening to me?" He stood at the kitchen counter, chopping vegetables that last fateful day, snick, snick, snicking the butcher knife through onions and green peppers, half dreaming himself away in a bubble of time. Escape. Yes, escape. He felt the room darkening, dropping out of focus. He longed for his freedom, and the glittery sharp blade of the knife did it, like always when he immersed himself in his work. When he held a knife of some kind, its edge pulled him like a moth to a flame. He drew a deep breath and abruptly stood someplace else, someplace far away. A hot, dry wind blew in his face. A sky black with clouds glowered at overhead. Jagged rocks crunched underfoot as he stood a hesitant step. "I'm here," the creature said. Jason turned, smiling for the first time. "Jason?" a distant voice cried. "You bastard! Listen to me, Jason!" It had started innocently enough in the summer of 1971 when Jason's father gave him a Boy Scout knife for his 13th birthday. He had stared at it hesitantly before pulling it from its box. Mother never had let him have one before. They were too dangerous, she said. "You're almost a man, and a man needs a good knife," Pa had told him, grinning and winking. "Treat her well, and she'll last a lifetime." "She?" he asked slowly. "Every knife has a personality. Take this one here." Pa unfolded the parts one at a time. How could there be so many? 2 bright steel blades, an awl, a bottle opener, and even a magnifying glass. Perhaps it was the magnifying glass that did it, pushed him from mere childish interest to odd fascination. "This knife," Pa went on, "can do just about anything, from starting a fire to skinning a skunk." "Pa!" "It's true." And Pa had laughed and folded all the parts away and pressed it back into his hand. "Just don't tell your mother I gave it to you, okay? It'll be our secret, man to man." "Cool," he said solemnly. Throughout June and July and August he carried it always, carving his initials into every tree he met until a 10-block radius of their house bore his mark. But the knife didn't last a lifetime. It didn't last the summer before it fell to pieces, the parts inside worn out from the countless times he'd opened and closed them. Then Jason started saving his allowance for real hunting knives, not kids' toys like the one his father had given him. He bought his real first Bowie knife that October, and the strong steel blade fascinated him, certainly better at carving wood than his scout knife had been. A few months later, he found a set of meat cleavers on sale at Walmart, an impulse buy that left him broke for a month. That Christmas, he found his grandfather's old army sword in the attic and took it to hang on his bedroom wall. His mania grew through high school. Ginsu knives from television ads, bayonets from flea markets, dirks and daggers and cutlasses and epis and scythes and Japanese throwing stars. When he graduated, his parents bundled him off to the far-distant University of Pennsylvania, hoping a change of friend and environment might broaden his interests. Instead, it served to focus him. The college fencing team found him an eager student. History courses provided information on ancient arms he might never have encountered otherwise. He also met Joanne Blyler there. She had like interests in history, though it was politics that drew her, and they found themselves paired in a little study group that led to a romance that led to marriage in their senior year. But their interests were perhaps a bit too far apart. While Joanne joined a law firm as a clerk, pushing, always pushing, he found himself left behind, alone most evenings with nothing but his collection of knives. Then the creature came to him, small and gray and vaguely bat-like, with silvery eyes and needle-sharp teeth. It seemed disturbingly familiar. Perhaps it had always been there, he thought, just waiting to be heard. Or perhaps he's desperate, lonely need brought it to him. Whatever, the creature came, whispering soft words, telling him how bright and beautiful his blades were. Why did Joanne never see that? Telling him everything he wanted to hear. He listened. Perhaps that was his greatest mistake. And as Joanne grew more shrill and insistent, he fled to the creature for comfort and understanding. It always knew what to say. It always made him feel good. Now in their little apartment, as Jason chopped vegetables for dinner and his mind floated on some other plane talking to a thing which could not possibly exist but somehow did, his wife's voice broke through the perfection of the moment. It felt like fingernails scratching on slate. "Jason!" He sighed, he blinked. The alien landscape faded, the creature with the eyes like still faded too. "Yes?" he said, looking at her for the first time that night. At last! She struck her classic angry woman pose, hands on her hips, feet set, neck tense. "Sometimes," she said. "I wonder if you're all here, Jason, and sometimes I know you're not. What do you think this is?" She held out her hand. In it, crumpled but still recognizable, lay his paycheck. "Money, dear," he said. He went back to chopping. "We've gone over this before." "Only $22? Where's the rest?" "I took it in merchandise, dueling knives, a match set. They're the best I've ever seen, with ivory hilts and scrimshaw on the—" "How could you?" she cried. She waved one hand at the racks of cutlery over the cabinets, at the knives under the counters, at the spray of axes mounted on the wall, at the guillotine in the corner. The guillotine was his prize. He'd built himself, and the blade, he had a letter of Providence saying so, had actually snicked off several aristocratic heads in those wondrous days of La Révolution. "Enough is enough," she cried. "It makes sense," he insisted. "Weapons hold their value. They're an excellent investment." "Try pearls," Joanne said bitterly. She turned and stalked from the room. A second later, Jason heard the front door slam. He winced and turned back to his knives, and in a moment stood on that barren plain with his only friend. When Joanne's father, a prominent local lawyer, filed the divorce papers 2 weeks later, Jason felt the loss more keenly than he wanted to admit. His wife's leaving left a hole like a missing tooth, and as he probed the edges, he felt a dull, unfocused pain. Realizing she wasn't coming back, he cried himself to sleep for the first time in his life. The creature came in a dream to comfort him. "Relax," it said. "You don't need her. Now your apartment has more room for weapons." Giggling, it told him where to go, what to buy. He sat up and began taking mental notes, distracted for the moment from his grief. A bankrupt jewelry store sold him display cases. The velvet handcuffed novelty shop provided padded hooks for his walls and ceilings. Under the creature's guidance, he set up a private museum. Sabers filled one wall of the living room, axes another, Swiss Army knives a third. In his bedroom, great swords hung over the bed, blades polished until they shone like mirrors. He lay there naked, late one night, with the lights on, and just stared at the reflections. "So beautiful," the creature told him. "So beautiful." He smiled to himself, and the creature told him he was happy. But still, he felt the hole in his life where Joanne had been. The jump from collecting to using those blades came long after that. He'd worked late at the antique shop cataloging a new shipment from Canada, and as part of his commission he took a pair of matched dueling knives, both with intricately worked ivory handles. By the time he finished for the evening, he found midnight had come and gone. He might have made it home all right if it hadn't been drizzling. Because of the cold and the wet, the streets lay deserted, and the night had an eerie quality. Jason stuck the knives in his overcoat's pocket and huddled under his umbrella as he trudged homeward. He started down the subway steps, same as always, same as he'd done 1,000 times before on 1,000 nights just like this one. But then footsteps echoed behind him. The light bulb overhead suddenly crunched and went out, little bits of hot glass raining down in the darkness. "Run!" something inside him cried, and he dropped his umbrella and fled in terror down the steps. Mugger Wolfpack. Time seemed to stretch. Outside, behind him, thunder rumbled, lightning flickered. He glanced over his shoulder, saw a black kid of maybe 15 laughing hysterically, his hair slick with water, his eyes wild. Then it was dark again, and Jason slipped and fell, rolling down the last few steps, feeling nothing in the rush of the moment, but certain somewhere inside that he hurt. "What you got, man?" The kid stood over him. How had he moved so fast? And started pawing Jason's pockets. Jason grabbed for his billfold, but instead came up with one of the knives. How it got in his hand, he didn't know. The whole scene was moving too fast for him to follow, too fast for him to comprehend. "Now!" the creature cried. Without thinking, he stabbed up into the black kid's belly. The blade slit cloth and skin and muscle with ease. The kid stopped laughing. For a horrible second, they just stared at each other in a flash of lightning, both surprised, both too shocked to move. Then the kid began to scream like a hurt animal, like nothing Jason had ever heard before. "Excellent," the creature whispered. Jason surged to his feet and ran. A train was pulling up when he reached the platform, and he staggered into it. An empty car, thank God. A whistle blew. The doors hissed shut, and the train lurched forward. After a minute, Jason realized he still held the knife. He stared at it in amazement for a few seconds, then quickly stuck it back into his pocket. Shuddering helplessly, he pressed his eyes shut and tried not to throw up. The smell of blood, the kid's blood, hung on his clothes like a cloying perfume. He gave a sob. He didn't remember walking home or going to bed. When he woke the next morning, he still had his coat on, and the knife, its blade stained a muddy red-brown, lay in his pocket. At first, he threw it away, but the creature murmured incessantly about what a prize it was, what a trophy, completely unique in his collection. He covered his ears, and still the voice nagged him, prodded him, whispering. Finally, screaming for silence, he rose and fished the knife from the trash can, held it in a trembling hand, admired it, the curve of the blade, the way dried blood picked out the design in its ivory hilts. How had he missed it before? In the shape of a dragon devouring its own tail. After breakfast, he carved a new notch in its handle. The physical act of crediting his kill gave him a rush like nothing he had ever felt before. Better than drugs, better than sex. He didn't need a letter to prove this blade had tasted blood. And deep inside, at the back of his consciousness, the creature urged him on. The next night, Jason made sure he worked late at the store. Payday. Same as always, he took most of his salary in hard, cold steel, this time a cavalry sabre, circa 1860. Engraved on its side were the letters CSA. Perhaps it had fought the Civil War at some Southern gentleman's side. Later, perhaps it had carried civilization west, helping defeat the hordes of Indians who waited behind every rock and tree to ambush innocent settlers. His boss had brought it back from Illinois, along with a truckload of other antiques. It had been love at first sight. The worn leather grip fit his hand like a glove. It had been meant for him. Feels good, doesn't it? Nodding, he hefted the saber. 8 little knocks in the hilt, 8 deaths attributed to its might. If only Joanne could see it, share it with him, then life would be perfect. Slowly he tested the blade with his thumb, dull as a butter knife. Can't have that, not with such a fine weapon, the creature inside him said, and he agreed. Such a waste otherwise. Taking a whetstone from his desk, he began to work the saber's edge back toward razor sharpness. The touch of the steel blade made his hands tingle. Finally, finished, he wrapped brown paper around it, but loosely, so it could be drawn. Turning off the lights, he set the alarms and locked the doors. Then, trembling, he stood in the doorway for an instant, just watching his breath miss the air. This felt like a turning point in his life, as though he stood on the brink of something tremendous, something great and good and powerful, like knowing God or being the first man to walk on the moon. It felt like that, only more so, because it was happening to him and not some stranger on TV. He could feel the sword's weight. When he eased his hand into the paper and touched its hilt, An almost electric tingle ran through his arm. Ecstasy. "You can win her heart again," the creature inside him cried. "She'll see reason. She loves you. But trust me," it said. "Do it. Do it, do it, do it." He hugged the saber to his chest and cast his lot. 2 blocks walk and he came to the subway. He fed the machine his token and pushed through the stand, impatiently waiting. Why did it seem to take forever tonight, when for the first time it truly mattered? Finally a train came. He boarded with a couple of old men, then sat alone at the opposite end of the car with the saber across his knees. He watched graffitied walls flow away on either side of the car. At last he reached the right stop. Joanne's parents' house lay 2 blocks away. She was staying with them until she got herself on her feet again. That's what her father had told him, the one time he'd gotten up the nerve to call. He'd just hung up, been too scared to ask to speak to her, but now, tonight, it would all be different. He climbed the steps, stood breathing the cool night air, turned and walked slowly and purposefully toward the right house. In his mind, he rehearsed what he'd say to her, something debonair, something romantic. When he rang the bell, she answered. Her eyes widened when she saw him, and she started to close the door. He blocked it with his foot. "Joanne, I have nothing to say to you," she said. "Go away or I'll call the police." I'm sorry," he said. "I miss you. I just wanted you to know that." "And what?" she said. She opened the door a bit. "I'm sorry?" Her eyes brimmed with tears. She missed him. She still loved him. "May I come in?" he asked. "Please?" She moved back. He entered. The TV blared from the living room, showing the end of some weepy romance. Hugh Grant skidded across the room, a bunch of red roses in his hand. "Are your parents here?" he asked. "They went to a play." "Good," he said. I needed to talk to you, alone. I love you, Joanne." She bit her lip and said nothing. "Look," he said. "I brought you something." He began to unwrap the cavalry saber. As soon as she saw it, she'd know what it meant to him, to them. And then she'd come to her senses and everything would be perfect. The saber would do it. The creature had promised. But when she saw what he held, she flinched back. "Get out!" she screamed. "I'm sick of you and your swords. Get out!" He stepped forward and she hit him. He blinked in surprise. She hit him again and again, flailing wildly, shrieking and screaming. "Now!" the creature commanded. And he swept the saber up. Backhanded, cleanly, severed her head. Blood sprayed across the far wall in the huge silent arc. Her body slumped, twitching. Her head bounced a dozen feet, then fetched up against a coffee table and stopped, grinning back at him with an impossibly happy expression. He hacked at her body again and again, stabbing, chopping, killing until blood flowed like water underfoot, and the creature inside him roared its approval. And then her chest lay open and he saw her heart. It pulsed briefly, then lay still. "No," he whispered. What had he done? He shuddered. "No!" He knelt and hugged her body close. Her heart came out in his hands, and he cradled it to his face, softly whispering of his love. Oh my gosh, that's the end of the book. Wow. I thought we still had lots of pages to go. Holy shnikes. I don't get it. It shows that there's still, what does it say? Oh, there's just one page. Dang. Well, what did you guys think? I thought that was a pretty dang good book. Pretty good indeed. Well, we have 13 minutes and 30 seconds and counting till the end of the show. I guess we could check out some Reddit ghost stories or something. Or maybe there's a short video that we could listen to. Let me check it out and see what I can find. Alright, so we're gonna do some Reddit ghost stories. This one is by Christian is Lost 72, The White Witch. In the early 80s, I lived in Okinawa, Japan. My dad thought that seeing the world would be an adventure that would help my brother and I become better men, and I have to say, I think he was right. Being in the military showed me cultures many would never get to experience, and I am thankful for every experience that life gave me, even the scary ones. While we lived in Japan, my father wanted us to have a full immersive experience, so he chose to move us into a small Japanese neighborhood off base. We lived in a little house at the top of an enormous hill in a cul-de-sac that overlooked, I kid you not, part of a huge zoo, and on one side a fairly large cemetery. Our particular house was set far above the monkey habitats about a mile downhill. Between us and those habitats was nothing but thick Indiana Jones-style jungle. Jungle the neighborhood kids and I would tromp through endlessly, ignoring the local warnings about poisonous snakes and ancient, untripped mines from World War II. We were the only American family living in that cul-de-sac, completely surrounded by Japanese families, and it was amazing. The kids loved us, and although we couldn't communicate through language very well, we understood each other perfectly well most of the time. Opposite us was an older couple with a lush garden surrounding their property. The older woman wanted us to call her Mama-san, and she had us helping her garden whenever she could coax us over with green tea and chocolate banana cookies. We loved her. She was so welcoming and generous, as was everyone else, actually. We lived in a wonderful neighborhood. The only drawback to Mama-san's home, however, was that she directly overlooked the cemetery. And that cemetery was unlike any cemetery I'd ever seen before. Because Okinawa is an island, burials don't happen very often. Instead, above-ground crypts are built, many of them built into the side of hills that make up the island. The crypts are large, made of huge arcs of polished stone set over a large square of that stone, which has a square insert cut into the middle of it for the coffin to be placed inside. Once inside, the square is inset with another piece of polished stone just inside, leaving a kind of shelf on the outside so offerings could be made to lost loved ones. Yin, food, flowers, incense, or some of the offerings given. Below Mama-san's house was a valley that swooped back up into the other hills opposite her home. The valley had both hills were covered with these crypts, and spiderwebbing up and down through the crypts were various stone step pathways that were old and badly maintained. It was quite a sight. One evening, Mama-san asked me to come visit with her alone. She had something to show me, but it was only for me as the older brother. Intrigued and a bit proud, I agreed. She took me to the back of her garden and sat me on the thick wooden bench that was carved with scenes of fishermen and men with swords, and told me she had a story to tell me. Mama-san then disappeared for a few minutes and soon returned with a tray that held hot green tea and sweet rice cakes. Sitting next to me, she smiled and commented on the colors of the evening sky as the sun began to lower. Mama-san said she had seen me, my brother, and some other kids daring each other to follow the stairway path down into the cemetery. You have to understand, the path from our little home area down to the cemetery consisted of hundreds of steps, many broken or cracking, in and out of bushes and at a steep incline. It would be dangerous for anyone, but the real test was seeing how long we could take walking through the crypts at night. Mama-san wanted to explain why that was a bad idea. Many years ago, during the war, Americans were thought to be devils, monsters that would murder innocent citizens for no reason other than to kill. That fear was the product of wartime propaganda used to encourage young men to military service and farmers to fight alongside them. But many didn't. Many ran. And with nowhere to go, nowhere to hide, hundreds of Japanese citizens hurled themselves off a cliffside rather than face torture at the hands of their perceived enemy. I was terrified at hearing this. I had no idea this had happened. I was mortified and hit with such sadness I started to cry. The sun was setting and the sky went from pink to blue to a deep orange and red. Mama-san reached out and held my hand, telling me not to worry. This was in the past, and the past is something we must always remember so we never go back. She went on with her story. One young woman had followed through with a sacrifice with her 2 children, but she survived the fall. She was in a coma for months. When she did regain consciousness, she was horrified to realize she was not with her children. They had been buried somewhere in that cemetery below, in an unmarked crypt that held many others. The woman would spend days and nights searching the cemetery, crying in pain, the torment of her loss unbearable, until the day she threw herself into the ocean to hopefully be reunited with her lost family. But they say she never found her children. Her act of suicide doomed her to purgatory. She would remain tortured for eternity. The sun had disappeared, the cemetery drowned in inky blackness, and the main path dotted with dim broken lights feebly illuminated small areas. Mama-san continued. She still wanders cemetery, she said, looking for her kids. You can hear her crying. And then she pointed down. I didn't want to, but I did. I looked. In the back of the cemetery, in the darkness, there was a white figure. At first, a bright white shimmer, moving slowly, kind of shaking. It moved from side to side, like it was moving among the crypts, and you could actually hear the crying. Softly at first, but then low moans and whimpers of pain as it got closer. I was terrified. I wanted to run, but Mama-san held my hand and whispered that she wouldn't come up here. We were too far. But that is why we shouldn't go down there after dark. She said many don't know her story and call her the White Witch, which angers her. It's best to stay away. It's best to pray for her. Mama-san said she comes out to see her often, hoping one day she will find her salvation. Needless to say, I never went down to that cemetery, not once, and I never sat back there with Mama-san again either. That was enough for me. I did, however, visit Suicide Hill. It's called Peace Prayer Park now, out of respect. I cried the whole time we were there. I prayed for all the souls and for forgiveness. So many Japanese citizens spoke to us, welcoming us, telling us stories, sharing with us. I didn't feel worthy, and my love for the country and its people was overwhelming. I'll never forget my time there. I'd like to go back to see if she's still there, wandering the graves, looking for her children. That was a good story. Shakespeare 824 said, "What a poignant, beautiful, compassionate story. So sad that so many lost their lives this way. Thank you for telling this to us." Liam's biggest fan. Wow, that's really beautiful and frightening at the same time. The way you write in just your lovely and respectful manner comes across so genuine. Thank you for posting this. If I could give you an award, I most definitely would, but instead I'll say this. Your story, your experience captured my utmost attention and submersed me in through your eyes. I thought I was reading a novel in the best of ways, and I wished to have it not come to an end. This was so finely detailed, you quite literally made me want to be physically standing where you once were, seeing the culture as you saw it. Mama-san seems to be a character that I'd adore to get the chance at sitting and speaking with her about her life journeys and experiences. Christian Isla 72 said, "Wow, thank you all for the amazing comments. I'm absolutely stunned by the reactions. I'm glad my story was able to affect you all in such a powerful way. It feels good to know my experiences can be shared with such amazing, powerful feedback. You are all inspiring." Salty Ann said, "Beautiful story. I love reading how other cultures are so accepting of the unknown and other things we share our world with. I envy your childhood. It sounds like a wonderful time for you, and I hope someday I can visit Japan. I'm trying to learn the language, and my oldest daughter and son want to make it a priority when he's older. He's 12. Thank you for your story. It was heartwarming. Schlep, rock, and get. Oh. Okay. Enough. Well, that's our alarm for the end of our time. Let's see. Well, boys and girls, it's the end of our show. Thank you so much once again for hanging out with me tonight on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. It was my pleasure hanging out with you, and hopefully you were entertained. Thank you to all of my friends out there, wherever you may be listening, Beyond The Omniverse tonight. I had a wonderful time, and I can't wait to do it again tomorrow night, or Wednesday, or maybe even Friday. I don't know. I'm really going to try hard to get in here. I'm thinking Wednesday, aka Hump Day, might be the best day. But we'll see what happens. Don't forget, we are all in this together. Together we can make the world a little better. And together we are Paradox Media, because without you, there is no us. If you have the means, ability, or initiative, make someone else smile. Make their day. There's so many terrible things going on out there, and just a simple smile or hello, an acknowledgement could really turn someone's frown upside down, turn their day around. Night, love and light to my friends out there, and to you. Thanks again for hanging out with me and listening to these scary stories. If you'd like to send me your very own scary story, feel free to do so. P.O. Box 663, Bayfield, Colorado. That's Bayfield, Colorado 81122. Nighty night, love and light. Take care of my yous, and I will see you back here, hopefully before the next weekend.